I thought he could hand my life's work to his favorite child on a silver platter. But when I walked out of the building, taking every patent client and key executive with me, my father realized a fatal truth. I was not just a part of the company, I was the entire empire. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel echoed with the deafening sound of applause. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over 300 of Chicago's most elite business figures. It was the 30th anniversary gala for Caldwell Freight, and tonight was supposed to be my coronation. For 5 grueling years, I had poured my blood, sweat, and tears into building a logistics software platform that revolutionized how our family business operated. Just this morning, industry analysts had valued my platform at $70 million. I stood at the edge of the stage, smoothing the fabric of my emerald green evening gown, waiting for my father to call my name. Harrison Caldwell stood at the podium looking every bit the formidable patriarch in his tailored tuxedo. He raised his hands to quiet the crowd. "We have reached a historic milestone tonight," my father projected into the microphone, his deep voice commanding the room. "Caldwell Freight is no longer just a trucking company. We are a pioneer in logistics technology. This $70 million valuation is a testament to the future of the Caldwell legacy." I took a deep breath and took one step toward the stairs leading up to the stage. I had written the acceptance speech in my head 100 times. I was ready to step into my new role as Chief Executive Officer of the tech division. I was ready to finally hear my father say he was proud of his daughter. And so my father continued, his eyes scanning the crowd, but deliberately passing over me. "It is with immense pride that I announce the person who will lead this entire $70 million tech integration. The new Chief Executive Officer of Caldwell Tech is my son Julian Caldwell." The world seemed to stop spinning. The applause roared back to life louder than before, but to me it sounded like shattering glass. I stood frozen at the edge of the stairs. Julian, my older brother, who had literally bankrupted a regional subsidiary just 8 months ago due to sheer incompetence, was practically jogging past me. He wore a smug, practiced smile, waving to the investors as he climbed the steps. He clapped our father on the back and took the microphone, launching into a rehearsed speech about vision and leadership. He did not write a single line of code. He did not negotiate a single contract. He did not even know how to log into the administrative dashboard of the software I created. Yet there he was, accepting the applause for my 5 years of sacrifice. I turned around and walked back to the family VIP table. The walk felt like crossing a desert. My mother, Vivian, was dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the overwhelmed, proud matriarch. Julian's wife, Harper, sat next to her, sipping champagne. Harper was a woman who married into our African-American family with a bizarre sense of entitlement, always carrying an air of superiority that my parents somehow found charming. When my father finally returned to the table, leaving Julian to work the room, I did not yell. I did not flip the table. I leaned in close so only he could hear me over the jazz band that had just started playing. "You gave him my company," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I built that platform from a blank screen. I secured the clients. Julian does not even know what a logistics algorithm is." My father did not look at me. He casually adjusted his silk tie and took a sip of his bourbon. "You built a nice project, Sydney, but managing a $70 million corporate division requires a certain type of presence. Julian has the natural authority for it. Besides, you should be happy for your brother. He had a rough year with his last venture. He needs a win." "A win," I repeated, staring at the man who had always treated my ambitions like cute little hobbies. "You gave him my life's work as a consolation prize because he failed at his own job." My mother reached across the table and gripped my wrist, her fingernails digging into my skin. "Sydney, stop it right now," she hissed. "Do not make a scene and embarrass this family. Julian is the eldest. It is only right that he takes the helm. You have always been so selfish. You need to learn how to support your brother." I pulled my arm away from her grasp. "I am not being selfish, Mom. I am demanding what I earned. Dad, you know he cannot run that platform. It will collapse in a month." My father finally turned his head to look at me, and the absolute coldness in his eyes chilled me to the bone. "A woman's ultimate loyalty is to her future husband, Sydney. You will get married eventually, and your assets will benefit some other family. Julian carries the Caldwell name. He will pass it down to his sons. The legacy stays with the men. You will stay on and help him manage the technical details behind the scenes. That is my final word. I sat back in my chair. The blatant sexism, the undeniable favoritism, the utter disrespect for my intellect and my labor. It was all laid bare in one devastating sentence. For my entire life, I had contorted myself to fit into his impossible standards. I had sacrificed my 20s, my personal life, and my peace of mind to earn a seat at a table that was never meant for me. Harper leaned over from her seat, her blonde hair falling over her shoulder as she let out a soft, patronizing laugh. She held out her empty champagne flute and pushed it directly into my hand. "Do not pout," Sydney Harper said, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. "Every great chief executive officer needs a hardworking assistant. Think of it this way, you will be great at taking his meeting notes. Just make sure my husband's coffee is hot when he gets to his new corner office tomorrow morning. Oh, and be a dear and ask the waiter to refill this for me." Harper smiled, waiting for me to break. My mother watched me, expecting me to lower my head and accept my place. My father looked away, completely unbothered by his daughter's public humiliation. They all thought they had me trapped in their web of family loyalty and corporate hierarchy. They thought I was just a worker bee who would quietly accept the crumbs they threw from their lavish table. I looked down at the empty crystal glass Harper had shoved into my hand. I did not throw it. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, I smiled. A genuine, relaxed smile that made Harper's smug expression falter for a fraction of a second. I gently placed the empty glass back onto the table right in front of her. "You will have to get your own refills from now on, Harper," I said smoothly. I picked up my evening clutch and pulled out my phone. As the jazz music swelled and my brother continued to boast to a group of oblivious investors across the room, I opened a secure messaging app. I typed a message to my lead corporate attorney. "Initiate Protocol 0. Prepare the severance." I hit send. The screen glowed with a delivery confirmation. My family had no idea that they were celebrating a kingdom they did not actually own. They had no idea that my father's ultimate betrayal had just signed their financial death warrant. I stood up from the VIP table, smoothing my dress one last time, and walked out of the ballroom without looking back. The countdown had officially begun. The fluorescent lights of the Caldwell Freight executive floor buzzed with a sickening hum on Monday morning. I stepped off the elevator at exactly 8 o'clock, carrying my usual briefcase and a cup of black coffee. My corner office sat at the end of the glass hallway. I had designed that office myself. I chose the ergonomic chairs for my development team and the massive whiteboard walls where we mapped out the logistics algorithms that saved this company from bankruptcy. Walking down the corridor, I felt the stares of the administrative staff who had already heard the news of my public humiliation at the gala. When I pushed the glass door open, I found my sanctuary had already been invaded. Julian was sitting in my custom leather chair with his feet propped up on my desk. Harper stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows inspecting her manicure. A cheap brown cardboard box sat exactly where my laptop usually rested. They looked like two children playing dress-up in a corporate boardroom. "Good morning, transition coordinator," Julian said with a grin that made my stomach turn. "Dad told you the news, right? We need you to clear out your personal items by noon. I am having the interior decorators come in at 1 to replace all this depressing tech gear with mahogany furniture. A real chief executive officer needs a room that commands respect." I took a slow sip of my coffee and looked at the cardboard box. "Transition coordinator." I repeated the fake title, tasting the absolute disrespect in the syllables. It was a meaningless position designed to keep me close enough to fix his mistakes, but low enough to never threaten his ego. Harper walked over and ran her manicured fingers across my desk. "Yes, Sydney," she said in that sickeningly sweet tone she reserved just for me. "You will be moving down to the 3rd floor with the regular administrative staff. Julian needs you to handle the tedious data entry while he manages the big picture. Plus, that natural hair of yours is a bit too distracting for the executive floor anyway. It does not really fit the Caldwell corporate aesthetic, does it?" I looked Harper up and down. She had not worked a single day in her life, but felt completely comfortable critiquing my appearance in the building my brain kept afloat. She was a parasite feeding off the wealth my father built and the digital infrastructure I designed. I did not rise to the bait. Anger is a luxury for people who do not have a plan, and my plan was already in motion. I need all the master administrative access codes and the VIP client contact lists by 5 p.m. today, Julian demanded, dropping his feet from the desk and leaning forward. Dad says you hold the keys to the back-end servers. Write them down and hand them over so I can officially take the reins. The fact that he thought server access was just a list of passwords written on a piece of paper proved how little he understood about the technology he was supposed to lead. Before I could answer, my cell phone vibrated in my pocket. The caller ID showed my mother. I answered it, putting the phone to my ear as Julian and Harper watched me with matching expressions of superiority. Sydney, please tell me you are not causing trouble for your brother, my mother said immediately, her voice tight with anxiety. Your father told me about the restructuring. I know it is hard for you to step down, but you have to look at the bigger picture. I asked her what bigger picture she was talking about, while watching Julian pick up one of my prestigious tech awards and examine it like a cheap toy. Julian has been under so much pressure. My mother continued, her tone shifting to that familiar manipulative pleading. He lost all that money with his last startup and he feels terrible about it. Harper is expecting their first baby soon, and he needs to feel like a provider. He needs this win, Sydney. You are a single woman. You do not have a family to support. Be a good sister, and just hand over the files. Let him have his moment in the sun. The sheer audacity of her request echoed in my ear. She wanted me to hand over the $70 million platform I built from scratch, just so her golden child could play pretend at being a successful man. She wanted me to sacrifice my entire career to soothe his fragile ego. She believed my worth as a woman was entirely tied to my marital status, and since I was unmarried, my professional achievements were just offerings to be laid at the feet of the men in our family. Of course, Mom, I said, keeping my voice perfectly even. I will give Julian exactly what he deserves. I will make sure the transition is unforgettable. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Julian was watching me with a satisfied smirk. Glad you are finally learning to be a team player, Sydney, he said. Now start packing. I want this desk cleared in an hour. I have important meetings to schedule and I cannot have you hovering around making things awkward. I walked over to the desk and pulled out a stack of manila folders from my briefcase. I placed them next to the cardboard box. These are the transition documents, I said calmly. They contain the server handover protocols, the client lists, and the administrative transfer agreements. You need to sign them to officially assume control of the tech division operations. Julian looked at the thick stack of papers and rolled his eyes. Typical Sydney, he scoffed, always trying to bury people in paperwork just to make yourself look important. He reached for a pen on the desk. Harper leaned over his shoulder, tracing circles on his suit jacket. Just sign them, baby, she murmured. The sooner we get her out of here, the sooner we can call the decorators. We need to measure the walls for the new art pieces. I stood perfectly still as Julian flipped the first page. My heart beat a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. What Julian did not know was that 5 years ago, when our father threw my business proposal in the trash and called my ideas worthless, I did not just cry in my room. I took my own savings and incorporated Novatech Limited Liability Company. I registered every single patent, every algorithm, and every line of code under my independent company name. Caldwell Freight did not own the software platform that was currently valued at $70 million. Caldwell Freight only held a licensing agreement to use my software. And hidden perfectly within that thick stack of transition documents were two very specific legal forms. The first was a unilateral non-disclosure agreement, binding him from discussing any proprietary code. The second and most important was a voluntary termination of the master licensing agreement between Caldwell Freight and Novatech. If he signed that page, he would legally authorize the complete shutdown of the software that ran his entire logistics network. He would be terminating the contract for the very platform he was supposed to run. He would effectively destroy the company infrastructure in one pen stroke. Julian did not read a single paragraph. He was too arrogant, too eager to play the boss to bother reading the fine print. He scribbled his signature on the first page, then the second, then the third. He flipped to the final critical document, the termination agreement. He paused for a fraction of a second, tapping the pen against the desk. My breath hitched, but my face remained an unreadable mask. Then with a loud sigh of boredom, he signed his name across the bottom line. There, he said, shoving the stack of papers back toward me. I am officially the boss. Now pack your cheap desk plants and get down to the third floor before I decide to fire you completely. I picked up the signed documents, holding them carefully against my chest. The paper felt heavy with the weight of my impending justice. I looked at my brother sitting in my chair and his wife dreaming of her mahogany furniture. They thought they had stolen my empire. They did not realize they had just signed their own eviction notice. I will have my things cleared out in 10 minutes, Julian, I said, walking toward the door. Enjoy the corner office. I have a feeling your time here is going to be very memorable. I walked out into the glass hallway, leaving them to their hollow victory. I slid the termination agreement into my briefcase. The countdown had moved to its final stage and the explosion was going to be beautiful. The morning sun broke through the heavy rain clouds, casting a golden light over my new Palisades estate. I stood in the massive chef kitchen sipping herbal tea and staring at my laptop screen. The transition documents my brother Julian had signed stipulated a 24-hour grace period before the server handover was finalized. That period expired at exactly 9 in the morning. I watched the digital clock in the corner of my screen tick down the seconds. Back at the Caldwell Freight headquarters, my family was preparing for their greatest triumph. My former lead developer was texting me live updates from the office. My father Harrison had invited 50 of our top investors and 3 major logistics clients to the main glass boardroom. He wanted to showcase a live demonstration of the software tracking system. My mother Vivian had arranged for premium catering and photographers to capture the moment Julian officially took the reins. Harper was reportedly pacing the halls, barking orders at the administrative staff and measuring the walls for her new expensive artwork. They were throwing a victory parade on a ship that was actively sinking. 8:58, 8:59, 9 o'clock. I pressed the execution key on my keyboard. The command prompt rippled across the screen, initiating the final shutdown protocol. I severed every administrative access point, every routing algorithm, and every client portal associated with Caldwell Freight. In the corporate boardroom, the chaos was absolute and instantaneous. My developer texted me the exact sequence of their downfall. Julian was standing at the podium wearing a custom-tailored suit he bought just for the occasion. He confidently clicked the presentation remote to display the live tracking map for Apex Global. Apex was our most lucrative client, and their entire holiday supply chain relied on our platform. Instead of a glowing interface showing thousands of active trucks, the massive projector screen flickered and went pitch black. Julian laughed nervously, telling the investors it was just a minor technical hiccup. He clicked the remote again, but nothing happened. Harrison frowned and aggressively signaled the information technology director to fix the presentation. The director frantically typed on his keyboard, but his face drained of color. He tried to bypass the firewall to access the core servers, but he hit a hard encryption wall. The investors shifted in their leather chairs, murmuring among themselves. Vivian smiled tightly, gripping her pearl necklace as she tried to maintain the illusion of perfect control. Harper crossed her arms, looking annoyed that her husband's big moment was being delayed by what she assumed was incompetent staff. Then the black screen illuminated with a blinding crimson-red background. Stark white text appeared in the center of the display, large enough for everyone in the room to read clearly. It was not a system error. It was a formal legal notification. The text read, "Intellectual property, exclusively owned and operated by Novatech Limited Liability Company. Master license agreement voluntarily terminated by authorized signature. All system access permanently denied." The boardroom fell into a suffocating silence. Julian stared at the screen, his arrogant smile completely melting away. He asked the tech director what kind of prank this was. He demanded they turn the system back on immediately so he could finish his presentation. The tech director backed away from the console and raised his hands in surrender. He told Julian and the entire board that this was not a glitch. The external server infrastructure had locked them out completely. They no longer had any administrative privileges to run the logistics network. Harrison pushed his way to the front of the room, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. He ordered Julian to call me and force me to fix the servers. He turned to the investors and tried to laugh it off. He told them this was just a disgruntled former employee throwing a temper tantrum and promised that corporate security would handle it. But the investors were not foolish. They were seasoned business veterans who understood the terrifying legal implication of the words projected on the screen. The lead executive for Apex Global stood up, his face tight with unbridled fury. He asked Harrison what Novatech was and why a third-party company was claiming ownership of their entire supply chain framework. Harrison stammered, sweating profusely as he insisted that Caldwell Freight owned every single line of code. He turned to his lead corporate attorney, who was standing near the catered buffet. He commanded the lawyer to explain to the investors that my claim was completely baseless and illegal. The lawyer opened his leather briefcase with trembling hands. He pulled out the thick stack of transition documents that Julian had so eagerly signed just 24 hours earlier in my old office. The lawyer bypassed the non-disclosure agreements and flipped directly to the final page. It was the page Julian had barely glanced at before scribbling his name to prove he was the boss. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and read the clause aloud to the dead silent room. He stated that according to the binding document signed by the new chief executive officer, Caldwell Freight voluntarily recognized Novatech as the sole proprietor and creator of the software. Furthermore, he read Julian had executed an immediate termination of the master licensing agreement, effectively returning all digital assets and operating rights to my private independent company. The heavy silence shattered into absolute pandemonium. The investors began shouting over each other. Apex Global representatives demanded their legal teams be brought into the building immediately. They realized their millions of dollars in supply chain logistics were suddenly paralyzed, and Caldwell Freight had no way to fix it. Harrison snatched the documents from the lawyers, his eyes desperately scanning the page. He saw Julian's bold, sloppy signature sitting perfectly on the dotted line. Harrison slowly turned to look at his golden boy. The son he had groomed for greatness, the son he had handed my empire to, had just legally given the entire $70 million valuation away with a single stroke of a pen. Julian backed away from our father, holding his hands up defensively. He stammered that I had tricked him. He claimed I buried the paper in a stack of meaningless administrative forms. He looked at our mother for help, pleading with her to make Harrison understand that it was not his fault. Vivian rushed forward, trying to place herself between her furious husband and her precious son. She cried out that it was just a simple mistake and that they could easily sue me to get the company back. She insisted that blood was thicker than water and a judge would see I was just acting out of spite. But the corporate lawyer shattered her delusion right there in front of the board. He explained that Julian signed a unilateral agreement in his full capacity as the acting chief executive officer. The contract was ironclad and airtight. There was no legal recourse for a mistake. Caldwell Freight did not own a tech division anymore. They were just an empty shell company holding a fleet of aging trucks and massive overhead debt. The entire $70 million valuation belonged solely to me. Harper, who had been quiet this entire time, finally understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. The luxurious lifestyle she felt so entitled to was gone. The corner office, the prestige, the generational wealth, it had all evaporated the moment her husband tried to play the big boss. She dropped her leather furniture swatches onto the floor, her face contorted in pure horror. She looked at Julian not with supportive love, but with absolute revulsion. Harrison clutched his chest, breathing heavily, as the investors stormed out of the boardroom, threatening massive lawsuits for breach of contract. Outside the glass walls, phones were ringing off the hook as dispatchers realized the entire national network was down. The legacy Harrison cared so much about, the male-dominated dynasty he sacrificed me to build, was reduced to dust in a matter of minutes. He had handed the keys to his favorite child, and his favorite child had driven the car straight off a cliff. My phone rang on the kitchen island. The caller ID showed my father's private number. I let it ring. I took another sip of my tea and watched the rain wash over the city skyline. The empire was officially mine and I was just getting started. I let the phone ring 3 times before swiping the green button on my screen. The connection clicked open and immediately, a wall of chaotic noise flooded my quiet kitchen. I could hear the distinct sounds of panic echoing through the Caldwell Freight boardroom. Chairs scraping against the hardwood floor, people shouting over each other, and the frantic typing of my former tech director trying to bypass a firewall he would never breach. I stood in the massive chef kitchen of my new Palisades estate, sipping herbal tea and watching the morning rain wash over the sprawling lawn. The contrast between my absolute peace and their total destruction was a feeling I wanted to bottle and save forever. Harrison Caldwell did not say hello. His voice boomed through the speakerphone, vibrating with a level of blind rage I had never heard from him before. He demanded to know what kind of stunt I was pulling. He ordered me to type whatever magic password I used and turn the system back on before he called the police and had me arrested for corporate sabotage and grand larceny. He told me the board of directors was threatening a mass walkout and that the investors from Apex Global had just threatened to sue the company into the ground. I took another slow sip of my tea, letting the warm liquid soothe my throat before speaking. I told my father that there was no sabotage involved, and certainly no theft. I reminded him that his new chief executive officer had voluntarily signed a legally binding termination agreement. The software belonged exclusively to Novatech Limited Liability Company, and Caldwell Freight simply no longer had a license to use it. I explained that when you terminate a lease, the landlord takes the keys back, and I was simply taking my keys and locking my doors. My father let out a harsh, bitter laugh that crackled over the speaker. He told me I was completely delusional if I thought some flimsy piece of paper gave me the right to steal company property. He yelled that I built that software architecture while I was living under his roof 5 years ago. His voice grew louder as he claimed that because I used the house electricity and the family internet router to write the code, every single algorithm and database legally belonged to him. He used his classic patriarchal logic, stating that as the head of the household, anything produced under his roof was his property by default. He said he was going to tie me up in litigation for decades and completely destroy my life until I begged for mercy. I set my mug down on the marble counter. The sheer audacity of his logic was almost laughable. I spoke clearly, ensuring my voice carried over the speakerphone to whoever else was standing in that panicked boardroom. I reminded him that 5 years ago he literally threw my business proposal in the trash. I reminded him that he called my software a cute little hobby and refused to give me a single dime of seed money from the family trust. I told him that I worked 3 different freelance design jobs to pay for my own private servers, the cloud hosting fees, and the legal representation to incorporate Novatech independently. I pointed out the bitter truth he always tried to hide from the board. I told him that while I was building a $70 million empire from my bedroom, he was busy draining the corporate accounts to pay for Julian's extravagant European vacations and sports cars. I reminded my father that he spent $2 million bailing out Julian's failed logistics startup just last year to save the family from embarrassment. I funded my own company while you were busy funding your son's lavish lifestyle, I said calmly. You do not own a single line of my code, Dad. You never did and you never will. I heard a muffled sob in the background. My mother, Vivian, either snatched the phone or leaned closely into the microphone. Her voice was trembling and thick with manufactured tears. She begged me to stop being so vindictive and cruel. She said the entire family legacy was falling apart and that the investors were furious. She pleaded with me to remember that we were blood, and that a good daughter would never do something so wicked to her own parents. She tried to use her classic guilt trips, claiming her blood pressure was spiking, and that I was going to give my father a heart attack if I did not fix the computer screens immediately. I felt a brief flicker of pity for the woman who had spent her entire life shrinking herself to serve my father, but it vanished instantly. I told my mother that a loving family would never publicly humiliate their daughter and hand her life work to an incompetent brother just because of his gender. I reminded her that she stood by in silence, and watched Harper hand me an empty champagne glass, like a servant at the gala. "You made your choice, Mom," I said. "You chose your golden boy because he was a man. Now you get to watch him lead your company through a crisis." There was a sudden scuffle over the phone line. I heard my father yell a curse word and my mother gasp before Julian violently snatched the device. His breathing was heavy and ragged. He sounded like a cornered animal trying desperately to pretend he was still the apex predator. He told me I was a bitter, jealous woman who just wanted to ruin his big moment because I could not handle taking orders from him. He shouted that Caldwell Freight did not need my stupid computer games anyway, and that I was vastly overestimating my own importance to the logistics industry. Julian insisted that the freight industry was built on handshakes, expensive dinners, and personal relationships, not lines of code on a screen. He boasted that the software was just a fancy tracking calculator, and that real business was done face to face by real men. He laughed a manic, desperate sound and proudly announced his counterattack. He told me he had a lunch meeting scheduled in exactly 2 hours with the chief executive officer of Horizon Global Shipping, one of the largest logistics firms on the East Coast. Julian bragged that he was going to walk into that high-end steakhouse, look the executive in the eye, and close a $50 million partnership deal, using nothing but the Caldwell name and his own personal charm. He claimed that once he secured that massive contract, my father would see that my software was completely useless and that he was the true savior of the company. He said he was going to prove that traditional business acumen always beats a computer nerd hiding behind a screen. I could hear Harper chiming in from the background, her voice dripping with venom and elitism. She yelled that Julian was 10 times the executive I would ever be, and that I should enjoy my little computer club while they signed real contracts with real money. She told Julian to hang up the phone because they needed to go prepare for their victory lunch and did not have time to argue with a disgruntled former employee. Julian told me I was going to regret crossing him. He promised that by tomorrow morning Caldwell Freight would be richer than ever, and I would be begging them for an administrative job just to pay my bills. He said he was going to show the entire industry what a real chief executive officer looked like when the pressure was on. I leaned against my kitchen counter looking out at the sprawling grounds of my fully paid estate. I thought about the automated tracking data, the route optimization algorithms, and the predictive modeling that Horizon Global actually cared about. I knew exactly how that lunch meeting was going to end without my system. "Good luck with that, Julian," I said quietly and ended the call, leaving them to their delusions. Julian smoothed the lapels of his custom Italian suit as he stepped into the dimly lit mahogany-paneled dining room of Chicago's most exclusive steakhouse. He handed his coat to the hostess with a practiced wink, sliding a $50 bill into her palm just to make sure everyone in the lobby saw him do it. He walked toward the private corner booth feeling like the absolute king of the corporate world. In his mind, the disaster back at the Caldwell Freight boardroom was just a minor technical glitch that he could easily smooth over with expensive food and expensive charm. He genuinely believed that the $50 million contract with Horizon Global Shipping relied entirely on his ability to order the right cuts of meat and tell the right jokes about the local country club. He took his seat at the heavy oak table, signaling the waiter to immediately bring a round of sparkling water and artisan bread. 15 minutes later, the chief executive officer of Horizon Global Shipping arrived. Preston Wright was a notoriously ruthless businessman who had built his maritime logistics empire through brutal efficiency and a complete intolerance for incompetence. He did not wear a custom-tailored suit. He wore a simple dark blazer over an unbuttoned collar, looking entirely focused on the brief window of time he had allocated for this lunch. Julian stood up immediately, flashing his bright, perfectly whitened smile, and extended his hand across the table. Preston shook it briefly, his expression remaining completely neutral as he took the seat opposite my brother. Julian immediately launched into his classic fraternity-style networking routine. He asked Preston about his recent golf trip to Pebble Beach and tried to drop the names of several wealthy politicians our father played tennis with. He ordered premium appetizers without asking what Preston wanted, trying to play the role of the generous host while signaling for a waiter to bring over an expensive bottle of sparkling water. Preston did not touch the food. He simply folded his hands on the table and stared at Julian with eyes that looked like cold steel. Preston stated that he was a very busy man and did not have time to discuss golf swings or country club memberships. He told Julian that Horizon Global Shipping was expanding its entire eastern seaboard fleet, and they needed the integration software to be absolutely flawless to handle the incoming cargo volumes. Preston leaned back in his leather chair and said that my father had promised a fully immersive live demonstration of the new predictive routing algorithm today. He expected to see the dynamic rendering on a tablet, so his own tech team could verify the load balancing features before he signed the $50 million partnership agreement. Julian swallowed hard, the false confidence slipping from his face for just a fraction of a second. Without my software running on his servers, he had absolutely nothing to show. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of glossy paper folders. He slid the colorful brochures and outdated two-dimensional bar charts across the table toward the veteran executive. He tried to use his slickest sales voice, claiming that the live digital interface was currently undergoing a routine security upgrade to protect client data and would be back online shortly. Julian tapped the printed spreadsheets, insisting that the traditional paper blueprints offered a much clearer vision of the corporate strategy anyway. He tried to upsell Preston on a premium tier account, promising exclusive access to the Caldwell Executive Lounge and private yacht events if Horizon signed the contract today. Preston looked at the glossy brochures like someone had just handed him actual garbage. He did not even reach out to touch the folders, letting them sit in the middle of the table like an insult. He slowly looked up from the useless paper charts and locked eyes with my brother. The silence at the table grew so heavy it felt suffocating. Preston asked Julian a very simple question. He asked where Sydney was. Julian stiffened, gripping the edge of the heavy oak table. He tried to laugh it off, saying that as the new chief executive officer, he was handling all major accounts personally now, and that I was no longer needed for these high-level discussions. Preston did not laugh. He leaned across the table and told Julian that the only reason Horizon Global Shipping had ever done business with Caldwell Freight was because of Sydney. Preston explained that I had personally designed the technical architecture that saved his shipping fleet millions of dollars in fuel costs over the past 3 years. He stated that I was the one who answered his phone calls at 2 in the morning when a server crashed, and I was the one who wrote the custom code that integrated their entire maritime database. Preston told Julian that my flawless technical execution was the single thread holding their business relationship together. Julian felt his fragile ego taking a massive public beating, and his pride could not handle the outright rejection. He leaned forward and decided to lie through his teeth, trying to salvage the disaster he had created. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper and told Preston that I was unfortunately let go from the company earlier that morning. Julian claimed that the pressure of the tech industry had finally broken my mind and that I was suffering from severe mental instability. He spun a pathetic story about how I had become erratic and dangerous, forcing the board of directors to fire me to protect the clients from my supposed meltdowns. He smiled a greasy, desperate smile and assured Preston that the company was finally in stable masculine hands and ready to move forward without my emotional baggage. Preston Wright looked at my brother with absolute unfiltered disgust. The older executive had spent 30 years navigating corporate sharks, and he saw right through the pathetic, fragile lie of a threatened man. Preston knew my work ethic and my brilliant mind intimately. He knew exactly what kind of toxic environment my father ran, and he knew Julian was nothing but a nepotism hire desperately trying to fill shoes that were 10 sizes too big for him. Preston reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the $50 million partnership contract that my father had prepared for this lunch meeting. He held the thick document in his hands for a brief moment, letting Julian see the bold printed numbers on the front page. Then, without a single word of hesitation, Preston ripped the entire contract in half. The sound of the thick paper tearing echoed loudly over the soft background music of the restaurant. He tossed the shredded pieces of the agreement directly onto Julian's glossy printed bar charts. Preston stood up from the table, buttoning his blazer with calm precision. He looked down at Julian, who was staring at the torn contract with his mouth hanging open in sheer panic. Preston told my brother that Horizon Global Shipping does business with brilliant innovators, not spoiled socialites. He said that Caldwell Freight was officially dead to him, and that he would be contacting my independent firm by the end of the day to transition all of his business directly to me. The chief executive officer turned on his heel and walked out of the restaurant, leaving the shredded remains of my father's legacy scattered across the dining table. Julian sat completely frozen in the plush leather booth as the reality of his massive failure crashed down on him. The surrounding tables had gone quiet, watching the corporate deal implode in real time. Several waitstaff were hovering near the kitchen doors, exchanging uncomfortable glances as they witnessed the golden boy of the Caldwell dynasty publicly humiliate himself. Julian could feel the judging eyes of the restaurant staff burning into his skin. His face flushed a deep, humiliating shade of red as his carefully constructed illusion of power shattered into pieces. He desperately needed to prove to the onlookers that he was still a wealthy, important man who was entirely unbothered by losing the biggest client in his industry. His hands trembled as he picked up the leather-bound wine list from the center of the table. He snapped his fingers aggressively at the nearest waiter, demanding attention with the petulant entitlement of a spoiled child. Julian loudly ordered a $500 bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon, claiming he needed a premium vintage to celebrate dodging a bad business deal. He sat entirely alone in the massive corner booth, drinking expensive wine over a pile of torn paper, trying to drown out the terrifying truth that his empire was already turning to dust. Julian sat alone in the cavernous leather booth of the luxury steakhouse, swirling the dark red wine in his crystal glass. The torn pieces of the $50 million contract lay scattered across the table like the wreckage of his entire life. He took another long gulp of the $500 Cabernet Sauvignon, letting the alcohol burn the back of his throat. He desperately needed the expensive wine to numb the terrifying reality that was crashing down around him. The restaurant was still bustling with wealthy executives and powerful lawyers. But Julian felt completely isolated in his failure. He tried to convince himself that he could just call our father and spin a lie about how Preston Wright was being unreasonable. He thought he could just blame the lost deal on market conditions or claim that Horizon Global Shipping was on the verge of bankruptcy anyway. His fragile ego was already working overtime to construct a new reality where he was still the brilliant chief executive officer and I was still the bitter villain. He drained the last drop of wine from his glass and took a deep breath, smoothing his silk tie. He needed to get back to the Caldwell Freight headquarters and initiate a massive damage control campaign before the board of directors completely turned on him. He raised his hand in the air, snapping his fingers at a passing waiter with the same arrogant entitlement he had used his entire life. The young waiter approached the table carrying a sleek black leather folder containing the bill for the untouched appetizers and the ridiculously expensive bottle of wine. Julian did not even bother to look at the total amount printed on the receipt. He reached into the breast pocket of his custom Italian suit and pulled out the heavy metal Caldwell corporate black card. He dropped the card onto the leather folder with a loud thud, making sure the waiter saw the prestigious logo stamped on the front. Julian gave the waiter a dismissive wave of his hand, telling him to keep the change and hurry up because he had a very important corporate crisis to manage. The waiter nodded politely and walked away toward the register, leaving Julian to stare at the shredded pieces of his failed legacy. Julian began gathering his glossy, unused presentation folders, shoving them hastily into his leather briefcase to hide the evidence of his profound humiliation. 5 minutes passed, and Julian began tapping his expensive leather shoes against the floor, growing increasingly impatient. He checked his heavy gold watch, noting that he was already late to face the firing squad back at the office. Finally, the restaurant manager approached the table instead of the young waiter. The manager was an older man in a sharp suit holding the black leather folder in both hands. He did not look impressed by my brother's expensive suit or his loud demands for service. The manager placed the folder back onto the table and opened it. Resting inside was the Caldwell corporate black card cut, completely in half. Julian stared at the two pieces of metal, his brain struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. He asked the manager what kind of sick joke this was and demanded an immediate apology for destroying company property. The manager kept his voice perfectly level and professional, but his eyes held absolutely zero sympathy for the sweating man sitting in the booth. He told Julian that the bank had just declined the transaction. He explained that when the restaurant attempted to process the charge, an automatic alert popped up on their system, indicating that the account had been flagged for massive suspicious activity. The manager stated that all accounts associated with Caldwell Freight had been frozen by the federal financial authorities, effective immediately. Julian felt the blood drain completely from his face, leaving him pale and trembling. He stammered that there must be a clerical error, because Caldwell Freight was a massive logistics empire with millions of dollars in liquid assets. He reached into his wallet and pulled out 3 different personal credit cards, throwing them onto the table in a desperate panic. The manager gathered the cards and walked back to the register while Julian sat paralyzed in the booth. Less than 2 minutes later, the manager returned and placed the 3 personal credit cards back on the table. He told Julian that every single personal account bearing his name had also been completely frozen by the bank. Julian could not breathe. His lungs felt like they were filled with wet sand as the terrifying reality of his situation took hold. The termination of the software license had not just tanked the company's stock, it had triggered an automatic financial audit by the corporate banking partners. When the bank saw the entire operating infrastructure of Caldwell Freight disappear into thin air, they immediately locked down every single corporate and personal asset tied to the family to prevent capital flight. Julian was a millionaire on paper just 2 hours ago, and now he could not even afford to buy a glass of tap water. The manager politely but firmly demanded another form of payment for the $600 lunch bill. He warned Julian that if he could not settle the tab immediately, the restaurant would have no choice but to call the police and report him for theft of services. Julian looked around the dining room, noticing that several nearby tables had stopped eating to watch his spectacular downfall. The humiliation burned his skin like acid. He knew if the police arrived, they would run his name and discover the massive corporate fraud investigation that was undoubtedly unfolding right now. With trembling fingers, Julian unclasped the $50,000 gold Rolex from his wrist. It was a gift our father had given him when he was named Chief Executive Officer just yesterday. Julian slid the heavy gold watch across the table toward the manager. He said the watch was worth more than the entire restaurant, and told the manager to keep it as collateral until he sorted out this minor banking glitch. The manager picked up the watch without a word and walked away, leaving Julian to flee the dining room like a beaten dog. Julian burst through the front doors of the steakhouse into the pouring Chicago rain. He did not even stop at the coat check to retrieve his expensive cashmere overcoat. He just wanted to escape the suffocating humiliation of the restaurant and get into the safe, comfortable interior of his luxury sports car. He ran down the wet sidewalk, slipping in his slick leather shoes, as he headed toward the private valet parking lot around the corner. He pulled his electronic key fob from his pocket, frantically pressing the unlock button as he turned into the alleyway. He expected to see the headlights of his brand-new custom silver Porsche flash in the rain. Instead, he saw a massive heavy-duty tow truck backing up directly to the front bumper of his prized vehicle. Julian sprinted down the alley, screaming at the top of his lungs for the tow truck driver to stop what he was doing. He waved his arms wildly, slipping on a wet grate, and nearly falling into a dirty puddle as he reached the back of the truck. He banged his fists against the side of the tow vehicle, demanding the driver release his car immediately. A burly man in a yellow rain slicker stepped out of the truck holding a thick clipboard wrapped in plastic. The driver did not look intimidated by Julian's expensive ruined suit or his frantic shouting. He simply held up the clipboard and pointed a thick finger at the legal paperwork strapped to the front. He told Julian that the financing company had just issued an emergency repossession order for the vehicle. Julian yelled that he was the chief executive officer of a logistics empire and that the car was fully paid for by the corporate account. The tow truck driver laughed, a deep, booming sound that echoed off the brick walls of the alley. He read the paperwork aloud, stating that Julian had completely missed the last 4 lease payments. The driver explained that the bank had been trying to locate the vehicle for weeks, but Julian had been hiding it in private, secure garages to avoid detection. Now that the corporate accounts were officially frozen, the bank executed an immediate seizure of all unpaid assets. Julian watched in absolute helpless horror as the mechanical winch lifted his beautiful silver Porsche off the wet pavement. His status symbol, his ultimate display of wealth and superiority, was being dragged away into the rain. He stood alone in the dark alley, shivering violently as the cold rain soaked through his thin suit jacket. He had no car, no money, no watch, and no dignity left. His grand $50 million deal was dead, and his company was a burning wreckage. Just as he thought his day could not possibly get any worse, his cell phone began to vibrate violently in his pocket. He pulled it out with numb fingers, seeing our mother's name flashing on the cracked screen. He swiped to answer, bringing the cold glass to his ear, hoping for some kind of rescue or comfort. Instead, a piercing, hysterical scream shattered his eardrum. Vivian was sobbing so hard she could barely form coherent sentences. Her voice was shrill and distorted by sheer panic. She screamed at Julian, demanding to know where he was and telling him he needed to get back to the family mansion immediately. Julian tried to ask her what was wrong, assuming this was just more fallout from the software shutdown. But the reality was infinitely worse. Vivian shrieked that unmarked black sport utility vehicles had just swarmed the corporate headquarters and the family estate. She cried out that federal financial investigators had stormed into the building with search warrants and boxes. They had bypassed the standard logistics audits and went straight for the hidden internal ledgers. Vivian wailed into the phone, telling Julian that the federal agents found everything. They found the fake accounts, the forged expense reports, and the millions of dollars he had quietly embezzled from the employee pension fund to pay for his lavish European vacations and his failed startup ventures. Julian dropped the phone onto the wet concrete, his entire world finally turning to absolute black. The relentless downpour, pounding against the windows of the Caldwell family mansion, matched the absolute despair suffocating the people inside it. The federal investigators had spent 5 grueling hours tearing the estate apart, seizing computers, freezing bank accounts, and boxing up decades of financial records. Harrison paced the grand living room like a caged animal, his immaculate posture broken by the weight of his impending ruin. Vivian sat on a velvet sofa, clutching a damp tissue, staring blankly at the spaces where the FBI had confiscated their valuable paintings. Julian stood shivering in dry clothes, traumatized by the destruction of his fabricated reality. The golden boy had run out of luck and the family was paying the price. Harrison stopped pacing and turned toward his son, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and desperation. He told Julian that the federal agents were preparing to file formal embezzlement and corporate fraud charges by the end of the week. He explained that taking $3 million from the employee pension fund was not a simple clerical error that could be swept under the rug with a fine. It was a federal crime that carried a mandatory prison sentence. Harrison stated that their only way out of this nightmare was to replace the stolen funds and stabilize the company valuation before the indictment was officially unsealed. He said they needed a massive injection of liquid capital immediately. Julian stared at his shoes, unable to meet his father's eyes. He muttered that all their accounts were frozen and that Preston Wright had personally ensured no other logistics firm would touch them. Vivian let out a sharp sob, wiping her eyes as she asked how they could possibly raise millions of dollars in a matter of days when they could not access their checking accounts. Harrison slammed his fist against the mahogany side table, making a crystal lamp rattle. He declared that there was only one asset left that could generate that kind of wealth and save them from federal prison. He said they needed to force Sydney to hand over the proprietary rights to the Novatech software platform so they could sell it. The sheer delusion required to believe they could still control me was staggering, but desperation breeds a special kind of insanity. Harrison convinced himself that because I was his daughter, I would inevitably cave to his absolute patriarchal authority if he just applied enough pressure. He spun a ridiculous narrative claiming that I only took the software to throw a temporary temper tantrum and that I would gladly surrender the patents to save my brother from a prison cell. Julian eagerly latched onto this delusion, nodding vigorously as he agreed that I was probably feeling guilty about shutting down the servers. There was only one massive problem blocking their master plan. None of them had any idea exactly where I lived. When Harper had aggressively evicted me from the corporate penthouse, I had packed my bags and disappeared into the city without leaving a forwarding address. Harrison pulled out his cell phone intending to call his usual high-end corporate security fixers to track me down, but quickly realized his accounts were blocked. Vivian stood up and walked over to a hidden wall safe behind a large portrait in the hallway. She opened the heavy steel door and pulled out a thick envelope containing $10,000 in untraceable emergency cash she had kept hidden for years. Harrison took the envelope and called a disgraced former police detective turned private investigator known for taking under-the-table cash jobs. He ordered the investigator to drop everything and find my exact location by any means necessary. The family spent the next 48 hours trapped inside their mansion, jumping at every shadow and avoiding the news channels broadcasting their corporate collapse around the clock. Harper spent the entire time complaining about the lack of household staff, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was facing a decade behind bars. On Wednesday afternoon, the private investigator arrived at the Caldwell estate, driving a battered sedan that looked entirely out of place in the wealthy neighborhood. He walked into the grand living room, smelling of cheap cigarettes and stale coffee, holding a manila folder in his hands. Harrison snatched the folder away, tossing the remaining stack of cash onto the coffee table. The investigator smirked, counting the bills slowly, as he explained that tracking me down had been incredibly difficult because I had used a private wealth management firm to conceal my recent real estate transactions. Harrison ripped open the folder and spread the glossy photographs across the glass table. Vivian and Julian crowded around him, eager to see where I was hiding. The photographs showed a breathtaking modern estate located in the Pacific Palisades, one of the most exclusive and heavily guarded neighborhoods in the entire country. The images captured the towering security gates, the wraparound infinity pool, and the flawless architectural design of a property worth millions of dollars. They showed my custom-imported sports car parked in the circular driveway, gleaming in the California sun. Julian stared at the photos, his mouth falling open in sheer disbelief. He stammered that there must be a mistake because there was no way a transition coordinator could afford a $4 million fortress. Vivian looked down at the pictures of the pristine estate, and a cruel, dismissive sneer curled across her lips. Her elitist mindset simply refused to process the reality of my independent wealth. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at the photograph of the massive iron security gates. She confidently declared that I must have run out of money after leaving the company and begged for a job working as a live-in maid for whoever owned that magnificent house. Vivian insisted that I was probably living in the tiny servant quarters above the garage, scrubbing floors to survive. Harrison eagerly agreed with her absurd assessment, his ego desperate to believe I was suffering without his financial support. He grabbed his car keys and told his family to get in the vehicle. He announced that they were going to drive straight up to those gates and violently drag me out of the servant quarters by my hair until I handed over the proprietary software that would save his legacy once and for all. The crisp morning air of the Pacific Palisades carried the faint scent of eucalyptus and ocean salt. I walked down the winding paved pathway leading away from my sprawling estate toward the main security pavilion of the gated community. The dense canopy of palm trees provided a perfect natural shade, filtering the bright California sunlight into soft golden rays. I was not running away or hiding in fear. I was simply taking a brisk morning stroll to handle a personal errand that brought me a deep sense of satisfaction. The delivery transport truck carrying my brand new custom-ordered vehicle was too wide to safely navigate the steep curved roads leading directly to my driveway, so I instructed the dealership to unload it at the primary security gates. I held a cup of steaming artisan espresso in my hand, savoring the quiet peace of a life I had built entirely on my own terms. I was dressed for a morning of high-level video conferences with international investors. I wore a bespoke three-piece power suit tailored flawlessly to my exact measurements. The fabric was a rich, deep sapphire blue, crafted from imported Italian wool that draped perfectly across my shoulders. My natural hair was styled impeccably, refusing to conform to the rigid corporate standards my family had always tried to force upon me. I wore a pair of sleek designer heels that clicked rhythmically against the pristine concrete sidewalk. I looked every bit the powerful, wealthy tech founder that I had become. There was absolutely no trace of the subservient transitioning coordinator. My brother had tried to demote me to just days ago. As I approached the massive wrought iron security gates that guarded the perimeter of the elite neighborhood, I heard a strange mechanical sound disrupting the peaceful morning silence. It was the sound of a struggling four-cylinder engine whining and sputtering as it fought to climb the steep incline of the canyon road. I paused near the manicured hedges beside the guardhouse and watched as a cheap dented compact rental car crawled up toward the visitor entrance. The car was a faded shade of beige covered in water spots and dirt from the recent storms. It looked entirely out of place among the fleets of luxury sports cars and armored sport utility vehicles that typically occupied this area. I narrowed my eyes as the pathetic little vehicle pulled up to the heavy security barricade. The front windshield was smeared, and the passenger side window slowly rolled down with a loud mechanical squeak. Peering out from the cramped interior were three faces I recognized instantly. Harrison, Vivian, and Julian Caldwell were crammed inside the tiny economy rental car, looking like wet, miserable rats desperate for a lifeline. They had clearly driven straight from their seized mansion, hoping to ambush me and drag me back into their toxic web of corporate fraud and familial obligation. I stood perfectly still, taking another slow sip of my hot espresso as I watched them process the scene in front of them. Vivian was sitting in the passenger seat, her face pressed against the glass. She was fully expecting to see me wearing a cheap uniform pushing a cleaning cart or carrying bags of garbage for the wealthy residents of the neighborhood. Her elitist mind had completely convinced her that I was nothing more than a desperate live-in maid scrubbing floors to survive after leaving the family business. Instead, her eyes locked onto my custom sapphire power suit, my flawless styling, and the absolute unbothered confidence radiating from my posture. Her cruel, dismissive sneer instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. Harrison was behind the steering wheel, gripping the cheap plastic rim with white knuckles. His face was twisted in a mask of furious desperation. He saw me standing there and immediately shifted his vehicle into park, ignoring the security guard, who was stepping out of the booth to demand their identification. Harrison slammed his hand against the car door, trying to unbuckle his seatbelt so he could storm out and physically intimidate me. He was fully prepared to scream in my face, demand the software codes, and physically drag me into that pathetic little rental car by force. Julian was sitting in the cramped back seat, looking pale and terrified, shivering in his wrinkled suit as he stared at the massive iron gates separating him from the wealth he had squandered. Before Harrison could even push his car door open, the deep guttural roar of a high-performance engine echoed through the canyon. The sound was so powerful it literally vibrated the ground beneath our feet. Coming up the private driveway from the transport loading zone was a breathtaking custom-ordered Aston Martin. The vehicle was painted a brilliant liquid silver with sleek aerodynamic lines and a custom interior crafted from premium obsidian leather. It glided smoothly past the security guardhouse and pulled up directly in front of where I was standing, completely blocking the cheap rental car from moving any closer to the pedestrian gate. The driver's side door opened, and a professional delivery concierge stepped out, wearing a crisp black suit and white handling gloves. He walked around the front of the magnificent sports car and approached me with a polite, respectful bow. He ignored the panicked shouting coming from the tiny beige rental car, idling just a few feet away on the other side of the iron bars. The concierge reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy silver key fob. "Good morning, Ms. Caldwell," the concierge said, his voice clear and professional, carrying easily across the quiet morning air. "Your custom vehicle has been fully inspected, detailed, and prepared exactly to your specifications. The delivery transport has been secured, and we thank you for your continued business with our dealership." I smiled warmly at the concierge, taking the heavy key fob from his gloved hands. "Thank you for bringing it up to the gate," I replied, my voice smooth and utterly relaxed. "The custom leather looks absolutely perfect." I stepped around the concierge and walked toward the driver's side of the stunning silver Aston Martin. I could feel the burning, horrified stares of my family piercing through my back. They were trapped inside their sputtering rental car, watching the daughter they had discarded and humiliated take possession of a vehicle that cost more than their entire remaining liquid net worth. Harrison sat completely frozen in the driver's seat, with one foot hovering outside the open door. His mouth was hanging open, his eyes wide, with a terrifying realization that shattered his entire worldview. Vivian let out a small, choked gasp, covering her mouth with both hands as she stared at the gleaming sports car. The delusion that I was a lowly servant scrubbing floors for the elite evaporated into thin air. The reality was finally hitting her with the force of a freight train. I was not the maid working in the exclusive neighborhood. I was the elite homeowner they were trying to infiltrate. I had built an empire so vast and untouchable that their entire generational wealth looked like absolute pocket change in comparison. Julian pressed his hands against the back window of the rental car, his face pale and sickly as he stared at the silver machine. He had just lost his own leased luxury car to a repo tow truck the day before, and now he was watching his sister casually accept delivery of a masterpiece. He finally understood that while he was stealing from employee pension funds to play pretend, I was quietly building legitimate wealth that he could never even dream of touching. I opened the heavy door of the Aston Martin and slid into the luxurious driver's seat. The obsidian leather enveloped me perfectly. I placed my artisan coffee into the polished center console and pressed the ignition button. The massive engine roared to life with a ferocious growl that drowned out the pathetic sputtering of Harrison's economy rental car. I put my hands on the steering wheel and slowly turned my head to look directly at my family through the reinforced iron gates. Harrison was shaking, unable to comprehend that the woman sitting behind the wheel of that machine was the same daughter he had told to pack her bags and leave. He thought he could track me down and bully me into saving his sinking ship. Instead, he was forced to watch me sitting on the absolute peak of a mountain he could never climb. I did not roll down my window. I did not offer them a single word of greeting or explanation. I simply gave them a calm, dismissive smile, the exact same smile they used to give me when they thought I was beneath them. I shifted the heavy silver machine into drive, pressed my foot against the pedal, and glided effortlessly through the private gates, leaving them sitting in the gutter where they belonged. I brought the heavy silver machine to a smooth halt just inside the perimeter of my estate as the massive iron security gates slowly began to close behind me. I watched through the rearview mirror as my father Harrison realized his absolute authority meant absolutely nothing out here in the real world. His face was twisted in a mask of impotent rage, but before the heavy iron doors could completely seal shut, Vivian squeezed her way through the narrow pedestrian entrance, dragging Julian by the arm. Harrison followed closely behind them, leaving their cheap, sputtering rental car idling in the street. They ran up the manicured driveway, panting and desperate, surrounding my custom sports car like a pack of starving wolves. Harrison slammed his heavy fist against the reinforced glass of my driver's side window, demanding that I roll it down immediately. His face was bright red and slick with sweat as he yelled that I was going to hand over the software source code right now because he was the patriarch of the family and I owed him my absolute obedience. I did not flinch or show a single ounce of fear. I simply pressed a button on the leather center console, lowering the tinted window just a few inches so I could hear his pathetic demands. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that powerful patriarchs do not beg for loose change in the driveways of their discarded daughters. Seeing that pure aggression was completely useless against my calm demeanor, Vivian instantly switched her tactics. Her face softened into a mask of maternal desperation, and she forced a stream of fake tears to spill down her cheeks. She pushed Harrison out of the way and gripped the edge of my car window, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Oh, my beautiful girl," she cried out, sobbing dramatically, wiping her eyes with a shaking hand. "My brilliant, beautiful girl. I always knew you were the smartest person in our family. I always knew you were destined for absolute greatness, Sydney, and I am just so incredibly proud of the woman you have become." Vivian continued her pathetic performance, claiming that she and Harrison only treated me so harshly because they wanted to prepare me for the ruthless corporate world. She lied through her teeth, saying they purposely pushed me away and withheld their financial support just to make me strong and resilient. She spun a ridiculous fairy tale where all the emotional abuse, the blatant sexism, and the constant humiliation were actually just a complex parenting strategy designed to turn me into a brilliant billionaire. She tried to rewrite 3 decades of neglect into a story of tough love, hoping my ego would be fragile enough to believe her toxic lies. Then came the real reason for her tears as Vivian reached through the narrow gap in the window, trying to touch my shoulder. I leaned away from her grasping hands, refusing to let her taint my peace. She begged me to buy out the massive corporate debt and pay off the stolen employee pension funds to save Julian from going to federal prison. She claimed that Julian was just a naive boy who made a silly mistake under immense pressure, and that a cold prison cell would completely destroy his fragile spirit. She wept openly, ignoring the fact that her precious son was a grown man who had actively chosen to embezzle millions of dollars to fund his lavish lifestyle. She wiped her eyes and tried to play her ultimate trump card, hoping to exploit my racial identity for her own benefit. Vivian lowered her voice, attempting to sound conspiratorial and deep as she leaned closer to the glass. "We are an elite black family, Sydney," she pleaded, her voice dripping with artificial solidarity. "You know exactly how the justice system treats our men in this country. You know they will lock your brother away and throw away the key just to make an example out of us to prove that we do not belong at the top. We have to stick together and protect our legacy against the system because blood is all we truly have in this world." I sat comfortably in the plush obsidian leather seat, gripping the steering wheel as I listened to her pathetic attempts at emotional manipulation. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or obligation toward the people standing outside my car. I looked at my mother and methodically dissected every single lie she just spewed into the crisp morning air. I told her that her tears were just as fake as the designer bags she was probably forced to pawn this morning just to pay her private investigator. I rejected her ridiculous claim about making me strong, stating clearly that trauma is not a parenting strategy and abuse is never a substitute for genuine love. I reminded Vivian that while she claimed to be building my resilience through intentional hardship, she was happily paying for Harper to go on luxury shopping sprees and funding Julian's endless string of failed businesses. I pointed out that she did not make me strong. I made myself strong in spite of her constant efforts to break my spirit and diminish my worth. I told her she had absolutely no right to invoke the very real struggles of black men in the justice system to excuse Julian's blatant corporate greed and criminal entitlement. I leaned closer to the window, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as I shattered her elite family illusion. I reminded her that Julian did not steal bread to feed a starving family facing systemic oppression. He embezzled $3 million from hard-working corporate employees so he could fly first class to Europe, buy imported sports cars, and play pretend at being a chief executive officer. I stated clearly that protecting the family legacy only ever meant protecting Julian's incompetence and financing Harper's lavish lifestyle while treating me like a basement-dwelling servant who was only useful for writing code. Julian stood silently behind our mother, looking pale and pathetic in the morning sun. He did not even have the courage to ask me for the money himself. He just let Vivian do the begging while he hid behind her skirts like a terrified child facing the consequences of his own actions. I looked right past Vivian and locked eyes with my older brother, forcing him to acknowledge his own failure. I told Julian that the system was not coming after him because of his background or his race. The system was coming after him because he was a common thief who finally got caught with his hands in the vault. I told my brother that my hard-earned millions would never be used to clean up a mess he created out of pure, arrogant entitlement. I pressed the button on the center console to roll up the window slowly, forcing Vivian to pull her hands back before her fingers were caught in the rising glass. Harrison started screaming again, slamming his fist against the reinforced door, but his voice was completely muffled by the thick acoustic glass of my custom vehicle. I shifted the Aston Martin into drive and let the massive engine roar, drowning out their pathetic pleas. I drove forward up the long, sweeping driveway toward my mansion, leaving them standing completely alone in the middle of the pavement with absolutely nothing but the impending reality of their total destruction. The tires of my Aston Martin barely completed a single rotation up the sweeping driveway when the blaring sound of the security alarm echoed across the manicured lawn. Harrison had not given up. driven by the sheer terror of federal prison and total financial ruin. My father shoved his thick shoulder into the pedestrian gate just as the heavy iron mechanism was attempting to latch shut. The metal groaned and protested against his weight, but the sheer adrenaline of a desperate man won the battle. He squeezed his large frame through the narrow gap, leaving Vivian and Julian trapped on the other side of the impenetrable iron bars. I watched through the rearview mirror as my father sprinted up my pristine concrete driveway, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. He was waving his arms wildly and screaming my name, his expensive suit completely soaked with sweat and rain from the morning storm. He looked absolutely deranged, a fallen patriarch realizing his entire kingdom had been reduced to ashes. I could have easily pressed the accelerator and driven away, leaving him to be handled by the armed patrol guards who were already moving quietly through the shadows of my estate. But running was a tactic for the weak, and I was not weak anymore. I brought the heavy silver sports car to a smooth, controlled stop right in the middle of the driveway. I picked up my steaming cup of artisan espresso from the center console, opened the driver's side door, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. I leaned casually against the sleek door of the vehicle, crossing my ankles and taking a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee as Harrison closed the distance between us. He stopped about 10 feet away, panting heavily, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. He pointed a trembling finger at my face and demanded that I wire $3 million to the corporate holding account immediately. He yelled that the federal agents were actively preparing the indictment and that the bank was moving to formally seize the Caldwell family mansion by the end of the business day. Harrison abandoned all pretense of negotiation and reverted to pure aggressive commanding. He ordered me to transfer the funds and buy out the crippling corporate debt to save his son from spending the next decade in a federal penitentiary. He shouted that as long as he drew breath, he was the absolute authority in our family, and I owed him everything I had. I stood perfectly still, letting his frantic shouting wash over me like a gentle breeze. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. I took another slow sip of my coffee, letting the rich flavor settle before I finally spoke. I told him that he was wasting his breath and his energy. I stated very clearly that he was entirely too late to demand any kind of financial rescue from me. I explained that I had been awake since 4 o'clock this morning, finalizing a very specific string of complex financial transactions with the primary banking institutions that held the massive Caldwell Freight corporate debt. I looked at my father and casually informed him that my private wealth management firm had officially purchased the entirety of the Caldwell family corporate debt directly from his frantic creditors just a few hours ago. I told him that I bought out the massive commercial loans, the highly leveraged logistical assets, and the collateralized mortgages tied directly to his failing empire. Harrison stood completely frozen on my pristine driveway. The aggressive red flush in his cheeks instantly drained away, leaving him pale and wide-eyed. Behind the towering iron gates, Vivian and Julian had heard my clear projected voice echoing down the canyon. Vivian let out a loud, dramatic gasp of pure relief, pressing her hands against her chest as she leaned heavily against the cold metal bars. Julian actually started laughing, a pathetic wet sound of sheer salvation echoing in the quiet neighborhood. They genuinely thought I had caved to their emotional manipulation and their endless guilt trips. They honestly believed that I had stepped in at the final possible hour to pay off their massive financial burdens and rescue the precious Caldwell legacy from total annihilation. Harrison let out a long, trembling exhale, and his rigid shoulders finally slumped in absolute relief. He wiped the heavy sweat from his forehead and ran a shaking hand through his graying hair. A sick, arrogant smile began to form on his face as his massive ego instantly reinflated to its normal size. He took a confident step toward me, telling me that he always knew I would do the right thing in the end. He praised me for finally stepping up and acting like a true loyal Caldwell. He said that buying out the bank debt was a brilliant tactical move to keep the family assets protected from any federal seizure or public auction. He actually had the sheer audacity to suggest that since I had cleared the debt, we could immediately merge Novatech back into Caldwell Freight and let Julian resume his role as the chief executive officer with a completely clean slate. I lowered my coffee cup and offered him a smile so sharp and cold it could have sliced through solid glass. I watched the arrogant relief washing over his aging face, and I decided it was the perfect moment to shatter his reality permanently. I told my father that he was completely and utterly misunderstanding my overall business strategy. I took a step forward, my designer heels clicking loudly against the smooth pavement. I told him that I did not spend millions of dollars buying up his toxic corporate debt just to forgive it and save his precious son. I explained that I did not clear his ruined ledgers out of some misguided sense of family loyalty or daughterly devotion. I bought the massive debt portfolio for one very specific and extremely satisfying reason. I bought the debt so I could personally foreclose on him myself. The arrogant smile evaporated from Harrison's face faster than water dropped on a hot stove. I stared directly into his terrified eyes and delivered the final fatal blow. I told him that I was now officially his primary creditor. I owned the mortgage to the grand family mansion where he had belittled me my entire life. I owned the liens on the corporate headquarters where he had allowed Harper to humiliate me and pack my belongings into a cheap cardboard box. I owned every single remaining asset connected to the Caldwell name, and I was initiating an immediate total liquidation of every single property to recoup my investments and destroy his company forever. Vivian screamed from the other side of the gate, a horrible piercing wail of pure devastation as the brutal truth finally crushed her elite social illusions. Julian fell to his knees on the wet sidewalk, sobbing openly as he realized he was not getting rescued. He was getting buried alive under the weight of his own staggering incompetence. Harrison let out a guttural, animalistic roar of blind, absolute rage. The horrifying realization that his discarded daughter now completely owned him snapped the last fragile thread of his sanity. He lunged forward, his hands outstretched, curling into tight fists as he charged directly at me with every intention of tearing me apart. I did not even flinch or take a single step backward to protect myself. Before Harrison could even cross the short distance between us, two massive shadows detached themselves from the manicured hedges flanking my driveway. My elite private security guards wearing tactical black suits stepped effortlessly into his path. The first guard intercepted Harrison's violent charge, grabbing him by the shoulders with terrifying speed and precision. The second guard moved in perfect tandem, sweeping my father's legs and forcing him completely off balance. In less than 3 seconds, they had Harrison completely immobilized. They spun the furious patriarch around and pinned him hard against the cold wrought iron bars of the security gate, right in front of his weeping wife and cowardly son. Harrison struggled and thrashed against the heavy iron, spitting terrible curses and screaming that he would destroy me. I took one final sip of my coffee, turned my back on the pathetic scene, and walked calmly toward my front door, leaving the fallen king pinned to the gates of my new empire. The grand ballroom of the Atlanta Biltmore Hotel was dripping in gold leaf and crystal for the annual National Black Excellence Charity Gala. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of networking among the country's most elite Black entrepreneurs, politicians, and corporate titans. Harrison Caldwell stood near the extravagant ice sculpture, shifting uncomfortably in his rented tuxedo. Just 48 hours after being pinned to my security gates like a common criminal, he had forced his family onto a commercial flight to Georgia using the absolute last of Vivian's hidden emergency cash. Vivian stood beside him, wearing a borrowed Oscar de la Renta gown that pinched her waist. The diamond necklace resting on her collarbone was a high-quality cubic zirconia fake acquired from a pawn shop just before their flight. They were playing a terrifying game of smoke and mirrors, desperate to secure a multi-million-dollar private investor before the banking foreclosures hit the public records and destroyed their social standing permanently. Julian and Harper were weaving through the crowd, holding watered-down drinks because they could not afford the premium open bar packages. Harper kept tugging at the hem of her rented designer dress, looking absolutely miserable, surrounded by successful people she could no longer pretend to outrank. Harrison had given his family strict orders for the evening. They were to project absolute confidence and absolute wealth. More importantly, they were ordered to control the narrative surrounding my sudden departure from Caldwell Freight. Julian approached a circle of wealthy venture capitalists and their wives near the oyster bar. He flashed his signature fraternity smile, handing out business cards that were practically worthless. A prominent real estate investor asked Julian about the sudden tech integration rumors swirling around the Chicago markets. Julian lowered his voice, leaning in with a perfectly manufactured look of brotherly sorrow. He told the investor that Caldwell Freight was currently going through a sensitive internal transition because my mental health had completely collapsed. Julian flat out lied to the circle of elites, claiming that the pressure of the tech industry had triggered a severe psychotic break. He spun a horrific story stating that I was currently institutionalized in a private psychiatric facility in California. He claimed I had been caught actively embezzling company funds to support a lavish delusional lifestyle and that the family had quietly let me go to protect my reputation. Harper chimed in, wrapping her arm around Julian's waist and putting on a fake display of grief. She whispered to the high society wives that my behavior had become incredibly dangerous and erratic. She completely fabricated a story about me screaming at the administrative staff and attempting to steal physical hardware from the server rooms, before corporate security gently escorted me off the premises. She sighed dramatically, telling the wives that it was a tragedy to see such a bright young black woman lose her mind, but that the family was doing everything they could to get me the medical help I desperately needed. The malicious lies spread through the ballroom like wildfire. The wealthy wives clutched their pearls and whispered the scandalous gossip to the next table. The venture capitalists nodded sympathetically to Julian, praising him for taking on the heavy burden of leadership during such a tragic family crisis. Julian soaked up their sympathy, letting his ego inflate as he subtly pitched a massive investment opportunity to help Caldwell Freight expand into the southern markets. He promised guaranteed returns, hoping to secure a verbal commitment for a cash injection that would save them from the impending banking foreclosures. Across the room, Harrison was cornering a billionaire logistics magnate from Texas. The patriarch poured on the charm, boasting about the generational strength of the Caldwell dynasty. He claimed that the company was on the verge of a massive global expansion and just needed a strategic capital partner to finalize the acquisition of new shipping routes. The Texas magnate listened politely, swirling his bourbon. He told Harrison that the pitch sounded promising, but he was confused about the recent whispers regarding Novatech Limited Liability Company and the proprietary software licensing. Harrison did not even blink as he lied straight to the billionaire's face. He chuckled, dismissing the Novatech name as nothing more than a dummy corporation created for tax purposes. He firmly stated that Caldwell Freight owned every single patent and algorithm free and clear. Harrison insisted that any rumors about a software shutdown were just the ramblings of disgruntled former employees who could not handle the rigorous demands of his corporate culture. He pressed the Texas magnate for a private breakfast meeting the following morning to finalize a $10 million bridge loan masquerading as a venture partnership. Vivian was working the charity auction tables, trying to maintain her status among the wealthy matriarchs. She hovered near the silent auction items, pretending to bid on expensive vacation packages she knew she could never actually afford to pay for. A prominent Atlanta judge approached her, asking about my sudden absence from the corporate world. Vivian dabbed at the corner of her eye with a tissue, putting on a masterful performance of maternal heartbreak. She repeated Julian's malicious lies, adding her own twisted embellishments. Vivian told the judge that she had spent countless sleepless nights crying over my supposed mental breakdown. She claimed that the family had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on the best psychiatrists, but my condition had simply deteriorated beyond repair. She used my non-existent mental illness as a tool to garner sympathy and social currency from the very people she was actively trying to con. The sheer depravity of their smear campaign was sickening, but it was their only remaining defense mechanism. They could not admit that a woman had outsmarted them, outmaneuvered them, and legally conquered their entire empire. Their fragile patriarchal egos demanded that my success be rewritten as a symptom of insanity. If I was crazy, then my legal ownership of the software was just a delusion. If I was institutionalized, then their impending bankruptcy was just a tragic side effect of a family medical crisis, rather than the direct result of Julian's staggering incompetence and Harrison's blinding arrogance. Harrison kept dabbing his forehead with a cocktail napkin, terrified that someone would notice the frayed edges of his rented suit jacket or the scuff marks on his shoes. He was a proud man who had built his identity on the perception of absolute dominance, and having to beg for investment capital while wearing another man's clothes was eating him alive from the inside out. Harper abandoned Julian for a moment to join a circle of elite real estate wives near the towering floral arrangements. She desperately needed to feel superior to someone. She targeted a young newlywed woman whose husband had just sold a massive tech startup. Harper leaned in, whispering conspiratorially about the supposed horrors of dealing with my mental instability. She claimed that I had grown violently jealous of her perfect marriage and her pregnancy. Harper spun a web of absolute fiction, telling the wives that I had tried to physically attack her in the corporate penthouse because I was deeply unhinged and incapable of finding a husband of my own. The women gasped, offering Harper sympathetic pats on the arm and praising her for her incredible grace under such terrifying family pressure. Harper soaked up their validation, using my fabricated insanity as a shield to hide the terrifying truth that she was married to a broke, soon-to-be convicted felon. Julian's networking was growing more frantic as the evening wore on. The venture capitalists were polite but non-committal, and the desperation rolling off my brother was becoming palpable. He pitched wild, impossible logistics expansions, promising returns that defied basic economic logic. When pressed for technical details about the software platform, Julian stumbled and deflected, constantly pivoting back to the character assassination of his sister. He told a group of Silicon Valley angel investors that I had intentionally planted malicious viruses in the corporate servers during my psychotic break, and that he was personally leading the heroic effort to clean up my digital mess. He claimed that investing in Caldwell Freight right now was a rare ground floor opportunity because the company was about to bounce back stronger than ever once my toxic presence was entirely erased from the corporate history. The absolute audacity of their collective gaslighting was a masterclass in narcissistic survival. They were standing in a room full of the most powerful Black leaders in the country, actively destroying the reputation of the only person who actually built the wealth they were trying to leverage. They used my name, my genius, and my non-existent breakdown as bargaining chips to buy themselves another 24 hours of borrowed time. Vivian continued her tearful performance at the silent auction table, while Harrison sweated through his collar, pitching empty promises to skeptical billionaires. They were a family united by shared delusion and mutual destruction, clinging to the sinking wreckage of their legacy, while the cold, dark reality of their impending foreclosure waited patiently for them just outside the ballroom doors. The heavy mahogany doors of the Atlanta Biltmore Grand Ballroom swung open, and the low murmur of the elite crowd completely stopped. I stepped over the threshold into the golden light of the crystal chandeliers. I did not look like a disgraced former employee hiding from the world. I looked like the absolute architect of my own destiny. I wore a breathtaking custom-designed floor-length white gown. The silk fabric cascaded perfectly over my curves, radiating a powerful angelic brilliance that instantly commanded the attention of every single billionaire in the room. My natural hair was swept up into an elegant crown, catching the light with every step I took. I walked into the charity gala with the effortless grace of a conqueror. The wealthy executives who had just been listening to my brother's pathetic lies immediately turned away from him and gravitated toward me. The Texas logistics magnate politely excused himself and walked directly across the ballroom to greet me. He extended his hand, welcoming me to the event and asking to schedule a private meeting to discuss integrating Novatech software into his southern hubs. I smiled warmly, shaking his hand and confidently discussing the future of digital supply chains. Harrison stood frozen near the ice sculpture, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his empty cocktail glass. His entire smear campaign was crumbling before his eyes. Vivian dropped her auction paddle, staring at my radiant appearance, unable to comprehend how I had managed to secure an invitation without her social connections. Julian backed away from his circle of investors, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as the very people he had been lying to realized that the brilliant software founder was entirely sane and infinitely more powerful. But it was Harper who completely lost her mind. My white sister-in-law stood near the floral arrangements, wearing her tight rented dress and feeling the last shreds of her unearned superiority slipping away. She watched the elite Black society wives abandon her to come admire my gown and praise my professional success. Harper could not handle being invisible. Her fragile ego demanded immediate validation, and her toxic jealousy required immediate destruction. Harper grabbed a fresh glass of deep red wine from a passing waiter, filling it straight to the brim. Her eyes locked onto my pristine white dress with a venomous glare. She gripped the crystal stem and began marching across the crowded ballroom floor, her rented heels clicking sharply against the polished marble. She navigated through the groups of wealthy donors, plotting her trajectory with malicious intent, hoping to force me into the exact type of emotional outburst they had been lying about all night. I was engaged in a deep conversation with a prominent Atlanta judge when I saw Harper approaching from my peripheral vision. I saw the aggressive set of her jaw and the tight grip she had on the oversized wine glass. I knew exactly what she was going to do, but I did not step back to protect myself. I simply finished my sentence and turned my body slightly so she had a clear, unobstructed target. Harper accelerated her pace as she closed the final few feet between us. She let out a loud, theatrical gasp, pretending to catch the heel of her shoe on the edge of a thick Persian rug. She threw her arms forward in a wildly exaggerated stumbling motion, launching the entire glass of dark red wine directly at my chest. The crimson liquid splashed violently across the bodice of my custom white silk gown, spreading into a massive dark stain that ruined the expensive fabric instantly. The heavy crystal glass shattered against the marble floor. The entire ballroom gasped in collective shock. The jazz band abruptly stopped playing their instruments. The wealthy executives and high society wives stepped back, covering their mouths in horror at the spectacular social disaster unfolding in front of them. The silence in the room was absolute and suffocating as everyone waited for my reaction. They expected a screaming match or a tearful exit fitting the narrative of the unstable woman they had been warned about. Harper quickly stood up straight, brushing off her rented dress and putting on a drippingly sweet mask of fake concern. She pressed her hands to her cheeks, widening her eyes in manufactured panic. "Oh my gosh, Sydney!" She cried out loud enough for the entire room to hear her pathetic performance. "I am so incredibly sorry. Your fragile mental state must have made you clumsy, and you walked right into my path. Let me get some napkins to clean up that terrible mess you made." I did not flinch. I did not gasp or look down at the massive red stain ruining my breathtaking gown. I did not scramble for a towel or try to wipe away the wine. I stood perfectly still like a statue carved from solid marble, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying power. The crimson liquid dripped slowly down the white silk, pooling at my feet, but I completely ignored it. I simply raised my chin and locked my eyes directly onto Harper's face. My stoic, unbothered reaction caused Harper's fake smile to tremble. She expected me to break down in tears or fly into a rage, but my total silence was unnerving her. The crowd watched in breathless anticipation as the balance of power shifted entirely into my hands. I did not raise my voice or address the audience. I took one slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing just inches away from my trembling sister-in-law. I leaned in close, letting my voice drop to a cold, lethal whisper that only Harper could hear over the sound of her own racing heartbeat. "Enjoy your last 5 minutes of relevance." Harper's breath caught in her throat and the remaining color drained completely from her face. She took a clumsy step backward, almost tripping over her own feet for real this time. She looked around the quiet ballroom, realizing that no one was rushing to comfort her, and no one was looking at me with pity. They were looking at me with absolute awe. I turned back to the prominent Atlanta judge, ignoring the dark red wine soaking my dress, and picked up our conversation exactly where we had left off without missing a single beat. The murmurs in the grand ballroom swelled into a tidal wave of absolute disgust, but the wealthy guests were not disgusted with me. They were looking at Harper like she was a diseased rat that had somehow scurried into their pristine environment. The prominent Atlanta judge I was speaking to slowly lowered his glass of scotch and stared at my sister-in-law with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. He asked her if she had lost her mind. Harper stood frozen in the center of the marble floor, her empty wine glass hanging limply from her hand. She looked around the room frantically, expecting the high society wives she had been gossiping with to rush to her defense and validate her insane behavior. Instead, the women she had just been lying to took deliberate steps backward, physically distancing themselves from her toxic presence. Harper tried to force a laugh, a high-pitched grating sound that echoed awkwardly in the quiet ballroom. She stammered out a pathetic excuse, claiming again that I had bumped into her, but nobody was buying the fragile lie anymore. They had all seen her march across the floor with malicious intent, and they had all witnessed my perfectly calm, unbothered reaction. The absolute contrast between her unhinged violence and my stoic grace completely shattered the smear campaign she and Julian had spent the entire evening building. The venture capitalists who had been listening to Julian's lies about my supposed mental breakdown suddenly realized they had been played by a desperate con artist. The tension in the room snapped when the heavy microphone on the main stage let out a loud, sharp feedback screech. Every head in the ballroom turned toward the podium. The president of the Atlanta Business Association, a towering, influential black billionaire named Marcus Sterling, stood behind the microphone. His face was set in a mask of cold, furious authority. The charity auctioneers and event coordinators stepped out of his way, recognizing that something monumental was about to happen. Marcus Sterling did not tap the microphone or offer a polite greeting. He stared directly across the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, locking his eyes completely onto my father. Harrison Caldwell shrank under the heavy gaze of the association president. My father tried to puff out his chest and project his usual patriarchal dominance, but the frayed edges of his rented tuxedo and the cold sweat pouring down his face made him look weak and pathetic. Marcus Sterling leaned into the microphone, and his deep, booming voice echoed through the massive speakers lining the ballroom walls. He stated that the Atlanta Black Excellence Charity Gala was built on a foundation of integrity, innovation, and community upliftment. He said that the association prided itself on vetting its members and ensuring that only those with the highest ethical standards were allowed to walk through those grand mahogany doors. Then Marcus Sterling dropped the hammer that would completely obliterate the Caldwell family legacy forever. He spoke directly to my father, his voice dripping with absolute disdain. He announced to the entire ballroom of elite entrepreneurs and political leaders that he had just received an emergency phone call from the federal financial authorities in Chicago. Marcus stated clearly and loudly that Harrison and Julian Caldwell were currently under active federal investigation for the embezzlement of $3 million from their own employee pension fund. The collective gasp that ripped through the ballroom was deafening. Harrison tried to shout over the crowd, throwing his hands up and claiming it was a massive misunderstanding, but Marcus Sterling cut him off immediately. The association president did not stop there. He exposed everything. He told the crowd that Caldwell Freight was entirely bankrupt, that their assets had been seized by the banks, and that they had spent the entire evening desperately lying to investors to secure a fraudulent bridge loan. Marcus gripped the edges of the podium and delivered the final crushing blow. He stated that the Caldwell family had the sheer audacity to walk into a prestigious charity event while actively stealing from their own working-class employees. Marcus Sterling raised his hand and pointed directly at the heavy ballroom doors. He announced that Harrison's membership to the Business Association was hereby permanently revoked for gross financial fraud and ethical depravity. He then looked at the perimeter of the room and gave a sharp nod to the massive private security guards standing by the exits. He ordered the guards to escort the trespassers out of the building immediately. The chaos that erupted in the ballroom was absolute perfection. 4 heavily armed private security guards marched across the polished marble floor, heading straight for the Caldwell family. Julian tried to run toward the exits to escape the humiliation, but 2 guards easily intercepted him, grabbing him by the arms of his cheap rented suit. My brother thrashed and whined like a caught animal, begging the venture capitalists he had been lying to just minutes ago to help him, but the wealthy men simply turned their backs and sipped their drinks. Harper completely shattered under the weight of her instantaneous social ruin. As the security guards approached her, she collapsed onto her knees right in the middle of the ballroom floor. The woman who had just thrown a glass of red wine at my chest was now weeping hysterically, ruining her makeup as tears streamed down her face. She grabbed the pant leg of one of the security guards, sobbing and begging him to let her stay. She cried out that she was supposed to be a wealthy executive wife and that she belonged in high society. She pleaded with the elite wives she had been gossiping with, screaming for them to vouch for her character, but the women just looked at her with pure, unhidden disgust. Harper was reduced to a groveling, pathetic mess, dragging her knees across the marble as the guards forcefully hoisted her to her feet and dragged her toward the exit. Vivian realized the absolute magnitude of their public destruction and tried to protect whatever tiny fraction of her dignity remained. The local society press and event photographers had rushed into the ballroom, drawn by the incredible commotion. Camera flashes strobed like lightning across the room, illuminating the spectacular downfall of the Caldwell dynasty. Vivian raised her hands, trying to hide her face from the relentless, blinding flashes of the cameras. She ducked her head, her cheap pawn-shop cubic zirconia necklace catching the light as she tried to scurry away from the lenses. The photographers showed absolutely zero mercy, documenting every single second of her tearful, humiliated retreat. Harrison did not fight the security guards. His spirit was completely and utterly broken. The proud, arrogant patriarch who had spent his entire life demanding obedience and respect was now being marched out of a charity gala in front of the most powerful people in the country. He looked over his shoulder as the guards pushed him toward the heavy mahogany doors. His eyes met mine across the crowded ballroom. He saw me standing there, radiating absolute power and unbothered grace, my white silk gown stained with the red wine his daughter-in-law had thrown at me. He finally understood that my success was not a fragile illusion he could control, but an ironclad empire he could never touch. The heavy ballroom doors slammed shut behind them, severing the Caldwell family from the world of wealth and prestige forever. They were cast out into the humid Atlanta night with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs and the looming threat of federal prison waiting for them back in Chicago. The ballroom slowly quieted down, the shock of the dramatic expulsion settling over the elite crowd. Marcus Sterling stepped down from the podium and walked directly over to me. He ignored the massive red wine stain on my dress and extended his hand with deep, respectful admiration. He welcomed me officially to the association and asked if I was ready to change the world. I smiled, shaking his hand firmly, knowing that the empire of dust my father built was finally swept away and my reign had officially begun. 1 week after the charity gala, the final crushing blow landed on the Caldwell family estate. A fleet of unmarked black vehicles and moving trucks pulled into the sweeping circular driveway of the suburban mansion. Bank officials, flanked by federal marshals, and my own private legal team marched up to the grand mahogany front doors. They carried the official foreclosure documents that I had personally authorized. Harrison Caldwell stood in the grand foyer, watching his entire generational legacy being boxed up and carried away by strangers. The bankers did not care about his former title or his country club memberships. They systematically went from room to room, seizing every single luxury asset to satisfy the massive corporate debt I now owned. Men in heavy work boots rolled up the expensive Persian rugs and carried out the antique crystal chandeliers. Vivian trailed behind the appraisers, weeping loudly as they catalogued her remaining designer handbags and the few pieces of jewelry she had not already pawned. She begged the bank officials to let her keep a specific diamond tennis bracelet, claiming it was a family heirloom. The lead liquidator calmly checked his tablet and informed her that the bracelet had been purchased with embezzled corporate funds and was therefore property of the estate creditors. I watched the live feed of the eviction from the security cameras my legal team had temporarily installed to monitor the asset seizure. It was a masterclass in absolute ruin. Neighbors peeked through their manicured hedges, watching the mighty Caldwell dynasty being thrown out onto the street. Julian paced the driveway, frantically dialing the numbers of his former fraternity brothers and wealthy business contacts, hoping someone would offer them a place to stay. Every single call went straight to voicemail. The elite society they worshipped had completely abandoned them the moment their bank accounts hit zero. Harper stood on the sidewalk, clutching a single small suitcase holding the few basic clothing items the federal agents allowed her to keep. The pristine white Range Rover she used to drive to her luxury spa appointments was loaded onto a flatbed tow truck and hauled away down the pristine suburban street. By noon, the massive iron gates of the Caldwell estate were padlocked shut and wrapped in heavy steel chains. A large white sign with bold red lettering was hammered into the front lawn, officially declaring the property as a foreclosed asset owned by Novatech Limited Liability Company. With absolutely no money and their credit scores entirely destroyed, the family had zero options for housing in their usual affluent neighborhoods. Harrison was forced to use the very last of his hidden cash reserves to secure a cramped, run-down two-bedroom apartment in a noisy industrial sector of the city. The building was wedged between an active train track and a discount grocery store. The contrast between their former sprawling mansion and this decaying concrete box was absolutely staggering. Vivian walked into the tiny living space and immediately covered her nose with a tissue, complaining about the lingering smell of cheap cooking oil and stale cigarette smoke. The walls were painted a sickly shade of yellow, and the stained carpet peeled away from the baseboards. There was no formal dining room and no grand staircase. There was just a tiny galley kitchen with a flickering fluorescent light overhead and a refrigerator that hummed loudly. Harrison sat down on a cheap plastic folding chair he had found by the dumpster outside. The man who once commanded boardrooms and dictated the lives of hundreds of employees simply stared blankly at the peeling paint on the wall. His patriarchal authority had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a broken, empty shell of a man. Julian and Harper were forced to take the second tiny bedroom, barely large enough to fit a single mattress on the floor. They spent their first night in the apartment listening to the loud rumble of freight trains rattling the thin window panes and the shouting of neighbors through the paper-thin walls. The harsh reality of extreme poverty hit Harper harder than anyone else. She had spent her entire adult life relying on the Caldwell wealth to fund her insatiable need for status and superiority. She had no college degree, no professional skills, and absolutely no concept of how the real working world functioned. Her massive personal credit card debt from years of reckless luxury shopping was rapidly accumulating interest. The collection agencies began calling her cell phone dozens of times a day, threatening severe legal action. Desperate for a lifeline, Harper tried to reach out to the elite real estate wives she had gossiped with at the charity gala. She sent frantic text messages begging for a temporary loan or an introduction to a wealthy investor. Every single message was left unread. The high society women wanted absolutely nothing to do with the wife of a disgraced embezzler facing federal prison time. Her pristine social network evaporated like mist, leaving her completely isolated and drowning in debt. With Julian legally prohibited from seeking employment while awaiting his federal trial, Harper realized she would have to find a job to keep them from starving. She applied for positions at high-end boutiques and luxury interior design firms, hoping to leverage her supposed refined taste. Every single hiring manager took one look at her blank resume and her highly publicized connection to the Caldwell fraud scandal and immediately threw her application in the trash. Nobody wanted the toxic baggage she brought with her. After 3 weeks of relentless rejection and dwindling grocery money, Harper was forced to swallow her massive ego. She took the only position that would hire someone with zero marketable skills and a ruined reputation. She was hired as a Tier 1 customer service representative at a massive, noisy call center on the outskirts of the city. The woman who used to mock my natural hair and treat me like a subservient assistant was now forced to wear a cheap, scratchy polyester uniform shirt and a heavy plastic headset. Harper sat in a tiny gray cubicle surrounded by hundreds of other minimum wage workers, staring at a blinking computer screen for 9 grueling hours a day. She spent her entire shift getting screamed at by angry customers, complaining about delayed shipping packages and billing errors. She had to read from a rigid laminated script, repeating the same forced apologies hundreds of times an hour. Her delicate, manicured hands grew calloused from typing endless complaint tickets into a slow, outdated database. Every time Harper tried to take an unauthorized break or complain about the harsh working conditions, a strict floor supervisor would stand over her cubicle and write her up for insubordination. her entire identity built on elitism and unearned wealth, was completely crushed under the weight of her new, miserable reality. She spent her 30-minute lunch breaks sitting alone in a dingy break room, eating cheap microwave meals and crying over photographs of her repossessed luxury cars. She finally understood the soul-crushing reality of the working-class life she had spent years mocking. While I sat in my custom corner office running a global tech empire, she was trapped in a gray cubicle begging angry strangers not to hang up the phone. The universe had delivered the exact poetic justice they all deserved, handing them the exact lives they had tried so desperately to force upon me. The warm evening breeze swept across the massive outdoor terrace of my Pacific Palisades estate, carrying the faint, soothing scent of the ocean. I sat in a plush lounge chair under the soft glow of the patio heaters, reviewing the final legal documentation for my newly established philanthropic foundation. The foundation was fully funded by the massive profits of Novatech Limited Liability Company and was specifically designed to provide venture capital and mentorship to young Black women pursuing careers in software engineering. I was focused entirely on building a future that looked nothing like my past when my private cell phone began to vibrate against the smooth surface of the glass table. The screen illuminated in the twilight, displaying an unknown prepaid local number from the greater Atlanta area. My private number was heavily restricted and known only to my elite circle of executives and legal counsel. I considered letting the call drop into voicemail, but my finely tuned instincts urged me to answer. I swiped the smooth glass screen and brought the phone to my ear. Instantly, a chaotic wall of harsh, abrasive noise flooded through the small speaker. I could hear the deafening blast of a freight train horn blowing in the immediate background, mixed with the wail of distant police sirens and the rumble of heavy city traffic. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the quiet, rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves echoing below my pristine estate. Piercing through the gritty industrial noise was the sound of heavy manufactured weeping. Vivian was on the other end of the line, sobbing uncontrollably into the receiver of a cheap prepaid device. She did not bother with a greeting. She immediately launched into a frantic, pathetic monologue designed to extract maximum pity. Vivian wailed that she had been forced to walk 3 blocks in the pouring rain through a terrifying, dangerous neighborhood just to buy a cheap plastic burner phone from a dingy, bulletproof convenience store. She claimed the corporate bank liquidators had officially shut off all their luxury cellular service plans that morning, leaving them completely cut off from the outside world. She described the horrific conditions of their new decaying apartment in excruciating detail, hoping to break my resolve. Vivian cried about the peeling yellow paint on the walls, the roaches scurrying across the stained linoleum floors, and the suffocating smell of garbage that permeated the entire building. She painted a picture of absolute misery, telling me that Harrison had not spoken a single word in 4 days. She said the former patriarch just sat on a broken plastic folding chair in the center of the tiny living room, staring blankly at the wall like a hollow ghost of a man. Her voice cracked as she shifted her focus to her precious golden boy. Vivian sobbed that Julian was currently curled up on a bare mattress on the floor of the second bedroom, trembling with sheer terror. She told me he was having constant panic attacks about his impending federal trial and the undeniable reality that he was going to spend the next decade in a maximum security prison. Vivian paused her weeping just long enough to gauge my reaction, expecting me to rush in with immediate promises of financial rescue. When I offered absolutely zero words of comfort, she rapidly pivoted to intense psychological and emotional manipulation. She desperately reached for every classic guilt trip in the matriarchal playbook. Vivian cried into the cheap plastic phone, telling me that blood is always thicker than water and that a family must unconditionally stick together during their darkest hours. She shamelessly weaponized religion, claiming that God strictly commands us to forgive those who trespass against us and that holding on to a grudge is a spiritual sickness. She elevated her dramatic performance, accusing me of deliberately and sadistically tearing my own mother's heart apart piece by piece. Vivian begged for just a tiny fraction of the Novatech wealth, asking for a small sliver of my millions, just to hire a decent defense attorney to keep Julian out of federal prison and move them into a respectable neighborhood where they would not have to sleep in fear. I sat perfectly still in the comfortable warmth of my luxury terrace, listening to her entire pathetic performance without interrupting a single time. I did not feel the familiar childhood urge to comfort my mother or sacrifice my own peace of mind to fix her self-inflicted disasters. I methodically analyzed her desperate words, noticing that even in the absolute depths of ruin, her only true concern was saving Julian's freedom and maintaining some pathetic semblance of social respectability. Vivian never once apologized for standing by while Harrison handed my $70 million company to my incompetent brother. She never apologized for allowing Harper to publicly humiliate me and demand I vacate my own home. She was only sorry that they had finally lost their unearned power. When her frantic sobbing eventually dissolved into heavy, wet breathing, I finally spoke. My voice was perfectly calm, steady, and completely devoid of any emotional warmth. I told Vivian that forgiveness is a divine gift, reserved for the genuinely repentant, not a limitless bailout fund for the arrogant and entitled. I reminded my mother of a very specific dinner conversation from 5 years ago when Harrison literally threw my software business plan into the garbage can and refused to give me a single dime of seed money. I reminded her that Harrison had looked me dead in the eye and explicitly stated that failures do not belong at the Caldwell family table. I pointed out that on that night, Vivian had simply nodded in absolute agreement, choosing to support her husband's cruelty rather than her daughter's ambition. She had actively participated in my emotional exile, fully endorsing the ruthless corporate culture that valued ruthless success over familial love. I told Vivian that I was not being cruel, vindictive, or malicious by refusing to pay for their mistakes. I stated clearly that I was simply enforcing the exact same ironclad family rules that she and Harrison had established a long time ago. You decided that failures do not belong at our table, I said, my voice echoing cleanly through the phone. I am just upholding your legacy, Mom. Welcome to the bottom. I did not wait for her to formulate another excuse or let out another dramatic wail. I pressed the end call button, completely severing the connection. I immediately navigated to my phone settings and blocked the prepaid number permanently, ensuring that no member of the Caldwell family could ever reach my private line again. I set the device face down on the smooth glass table and picked up my luxury fountain pen. I turned my attention back to the legal documents for my new philanthropic foundation, feeling entirely unbothered and finally completely free. I leaned back in my chair and took a deep breath of the fresh ocean air, letting the absolute finality of the moment wash over my spirit. For decades, I had carried the heavy, suffocating weight of their expectations, trying desperately to prove my intellectual worth to people who were completely committed to misunderstanding me. Every line of code I had written in the early days of Novatech was fueled by a toxic desire to earn a seat at my father's table. But sitting on the terrace of a $12 million estate that I purchased with my own brilliant mind, I realized I never needed their table at all. I had built an entire kingdom where I was the sole architect, the chief executive officer, and the undisputed ruler. I unfastened the cap of my pen and signed my name boldly across the bottom of the foundation charter, officially authorizing a $5 million initial endowment. The money that Harrison and Vivian had just begged for to save a corporate criminal was now legally bound to fund the education and business ventures of hundreds of brilliant young black women who would never have to beg for a seat at any man's table. I looked at the signature on the crisp white paper, knowing that this was my true legacy. The Caldwell dynasty, built on arrogance, sexism, and fraud, was actively rotting away in a cramped, noisy apartment next to a train track. My empire, built on resilience, innovation, and unbreakable boundaries, was just beginning to rise. The sunset painted the California sky in brilliant shades of violet and gold, signaling the quiet, beautiful end of a war I had already won. The setting sun cast a brilliant golden glow over the Atlanta skyline, reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of my new corner office. I stood at the edge of the towering skyscraper, looking down at the sprawling city below. The streets were filled with evening traffic, tracing glowing lines of red and white light through the urban landscape. My hands rested lightly on the cool glass, and I took a deep, slow breath of the conditioned air. This building was the crown jewel of the downtown tech district, and it belonged entirely to Novatech Limited Liability Company. There were no rented desks and no borrowed servers here. Every single floor of this massive glass tower was funded by the $70 million valuation I had built with my own two hands. I walked away from the window and ran my fingers across the smooth surface of my custom mahogany desk, tracing the intricate wood grain. The silence in the room was absolute and pristine, unbroken by the frantic demands of entitled relatives or the toxic screaming of a failed patriarch. I picked up a sleek wireless tablet from the center of the desk and swiped through the live security feeds of the building. Perimeter armed guards patrolled the lobby, ensuring that no unauthorized personnel could ever breach the sanctuary I had created. I authorized a final biometric security lock, sealing the executive floor down for the evening, knowing that my intellectual property was infinitely safe in this high-tech fortress. I moved toward the private wet bar, situated in the corner of the suite, running my hand along the polished marble countertop. The refrigerator hummed quietly as I opened the glass door to retrieve a bottle of chilled, sparkling water. I poured the clear liquid into a heavy crystal glass, watching the tiny bubbles rise to the surface. I took a long drink, letting the icy water soothe my throat. After a long day of international video conferences and global strategy sessions, the massive flat-screen monitor mounted on the adjacent wall displayed the climbing stock prices of our newest enterprise partners. I watched the green arrows tick upward, representing millions of dollars in secured revenue streams, generated entirely by the algorithms I wrote from scratch. The heavy frosted glass doors of my executive suite slid open with a soft mechanical whisper. I turned away from the digital stock ticker to see my core team walking into the room. These were not nepotism hires or spineless executives seeking favor from a tyrant. This was the brilliant, diverse team of developers, engineers, and strategists who worked tirelessly alongside me to build this new empire from the ground up. They were the brightest minds in the logistics technology industry, and they chose to follow my leadership because they respected my intellect and my vision. My lead software architect, a brilliant black woman who helped me encrypt the original mainframes, carried a silver tray with a bottle of premium champagne and several crystal flutes. The chief operations officer, a sharp young executive who operated the global network with absolute precision, carried a digital tablet glowing with real-time data metrics. They were laughing and talking excitedly, the energy in the room vibrating with genuine camaraderie and mutual respect. There was no toxic competition and no manipulative gaslighting. Here, we built a corporate culture rooted entirely in innovation, transparency, and shared success. The operations officer tapped the screen of his tablet and routed the display directly to the massive interactive glass wall in the center of my office. The glass illuminated with a stunning three-dimensional holographic map of the globe. Bright blue routing lines crisscrossed across the oceans and continents, tracking thousands of active shipping freighters and cargo planes in real time. This was not just a regional update. This was the official global launch of our newest predictive logistics software. The team gathered around the glowing digital map, watching the deployment metrics skyrocket as international shipping conglomerates integrated our platform into their daily operations. The numbers climbing on the screen represented billions of dollars in optimized trade routes and carbon emission reductions. The lead architect popped the cork on the champagne bottle, the festive sound echoing perfectly through the spacious office. She poured the sparkling liquid into the crystal flutes and handed them out to the executive team. She handed the final glass to me, offering a warm, respectful smile that contained absolutely zero hidden agendas. She raised her own glass toward the ceiling and offered a toast to the woman who refused to let anyone dim her light. The entire room raised their glasses in unison, their faces reflecting the bright blue light of the global tracking map. They looked at me with genuine admiration, celebrating a leader who had protected them, rewarded their hard work, and built a sanctuary for true innovation. I raised my glass to meet theirs, the crystal chiming softly in the quiet room. I took a sip of the cold, crisp champagne, letting the sweet taste linger on my tongue. I looked around the room at the brilliant, diverse faces of my chosen family. I listened to their laughter and watched them point excitedly at the expanding digital network, lighting up the glass wall. They were discussing the upcoming expansion into the European markets, mapping out new coding frameworks and building the foundation for our next massive software update. Their passion was completely contagious, and it filled the executive suite with a vibrant, unstoppable creative energy. The holographic globe continued to spin on the glass wall, tracking the seamless flow of global commerce powered entirely by the mathematical models we designed together. The operations officer showed me a live feed of our primary client onboarding queue, demonstrating that we had just signed 3 more international maritime fleets. The sheer volume of incoming revenue was staggering, but the money was secondary to the absolute joy of creating something flawless. The champagne bottle was emptied quickly as the team exchanged high fives and congratulatory hugs, reveling in the massive triumph of our highly anticipated global launch event. I turned my gaze back toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city of Atlanta as the twilight deepened into a rich purple night. The streetlights flickered on, illuminating the path forward. A soft, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of bitter vengeance or petty triumph. It was the calm, quiet smile of a woman who had fought a massive, brutal war for her own soul and emerged completely victorious. I stood at the very top of the world, breathing in the rare, intoxicating air of pure, unadulterated freedom and absolute peace. The dawn broke over the Atlanta skyline, casting a sharp silver light across the heavy custom mahogany desk in my executive suite. The empty crystal champagne flutes from last night's launch celebration had already been cleared away by the dedicated night staff, leaving the massive office perfectly pristine and completely quiet. I sat in my ergonomic leather chair, watching the sprawling city wake up through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, the vibrant, energetic pulse of the morning traffic moving. Hundreds of feet below my private sanctuary, my chief legal officer, a brilliant black woman named Valerie, walked through the frosted glass doors, carrying a thick, leather-bound portfolio. She did not knock tentatively or hover nervously, like the terrified employees at my father's old logistics company. She strode into the room with absolute confidence and mutual respect, placing the heavy document directly in the center of my desk. "We did it, Sydney," Valerie said, her voice carrying a quiet electric thrill. "The European Trade Commission just approved the final regulatory hurdles for our international expansion. This contract officially acquires the largest maritime shipping network in the Northern Hemisphere, giving Novatech absolute global market dominance in the supply chain sector." I looked down at the crisp white pages filled with dense legal text and staggering financial projections. The valuation of my independent company was no longer hovering at $70 million. This single signature would push my tech empire well past the billion-dollar threshold, cementing my lasting legacy as one of the most powerful tech founders in modern corporate history. I reached out and picked up my heavy silver fountain pen, letting the cool, polished metal rest comfortably between my fingers. I did not feel the frantic, desperate need for external validation that used to drive my every waking moment. I did not feel the suffocating pressure to prove my intellectual worth to a family that was completely committed to misunderstanding me. I looked up at Valerie and thanked her for her flawless execution of the international merger. She smiled warmly, acknowledging the shared monumental victory, before quietly stepping out of the office to let me review the final binding terms alone. The heavy glass doors slid shut, sealing me inside the quiet vastness of my newly conquered kingdom. I leaned back in my chair and let my eyes drift away from the complex contract out toward the endless blue horizon stretching far beyond the city limits, into the deep distance. For years, I truly believed that my secret weapon was the proprietary software itself. I thought that writing the perfect algorithm, building the most efficient predictive modeling system, and mastering the back-end server architecture would be the ultimate impenetrable shield against my family's toxic emotional abuse. I assumed that undeniable financial success would finally force Harrison to respect me as an equal and make Vivian acknowledge my intrinsic worth. I thought the patents and the millions of lines of code were my impenetrable armor, but sitting here at the absolute pinnacle of corporate power, I finally understood a much more profound and liberating truth. My real secret weapon was never the technology or the massive server farms. It was my unshakable inner resilience. It was my absolute unwavering refusal to internalize the poisonous narrative they tried to force feed me since childhood. When they called me a selfish spinster, I deliberately chose to hear independent visionary. When they told me my natural hair and bold, unapologetic ambition did not fit their elite conservative corporate aesthetic, I chose to build my own boardroom from scratch where authenticity was the only acceptable currency. When they demanded I shrink myself to protect Julian's fragile, unearned ego and Harper's toxic superiority, I chose to expand my footprint until I completely eclipsed their entire miserable existence. The software was just a tool, but my resilient mind was the actual empire. The true victory was not seizing their generational wealth or watching their foreclosure signs get hammered into the pristine manicured lawns of their suburban mansions. The true victory was entirely internal. It was the profound, absolute peace that washed over my spirit when I finally stopped waiting for their permission to be great. I realized that a toxic family system relies entirely on the blind compliance of its designated scapegoat. The exact moment I stopped playing my assigned role, the exact moment I stopped begging for a seat at a table that was actively rotting from the inside out, their entire illusion of power shattered into a million worthless pieces. I thought about the new philanthropic foundation I had established yesterday, the millions of dollars that would now flow directly into the hands of young, brilliant Black women pursuing degrees in software engineering and advanced robotics. This new European acquisition contract resting on my desk would exponentially increase that endowment, creating a massive pipeline of diverse talent that would completely disrupt the tech industry for generations to come. I was actively building the exact support system I desperately needed when I was a young girl writing code in a lonely bedroom. I looked back down at the multi-billion-dollar acquisition contract. There was absolutely no hesitation in my spirit, no lingering doubt about my capacity to lead on a massive global stage. I uncapped the silver fountain pen and pressed the sharp metal nib against the thick textured paper. I signed my name with bold, sweeping, unmistakable strokes, the dark ink permanently binding my independent company to a limitless international future. I was not signing this document as the forgotten sister or the dismissed daughter. I was signing it as the undisputed architect of a digital revolution. I closed the heavy leather portfolio and stood up from my desk, walking back over to the towering glass walls. The morning sun was fully above the horizon, now bathing the city of Atlanta in a bright, blinding golden light. The streets below were filled with thousands of people rushing to their jobs, completely unaware of the massive tectonic shifts that had just occurred in the corporate atmosphere directly above them. I rested my open palm against the cool, thick glass, feeling the solid, unyielding structure of the skyscraper I owned absolutely free and clear. I had completely rewritten the rules of the game. I took the childhood trauma, the blatant sexism, the racial microaggressions, and the profound emotional neglect, and I fed it all directly into the roaring furnace of my ambition. I forged an unbreakable ironclad armor from the very weapons they tried to use against me to keep me subservient. I was no longer a silent pawn in Harrison Caldwell's pathetic patriarchal chess match. I was the reigning queen of my own sovereign territory. My legacy was not tied to a toxic bloodline that demanded my constant subjugation. It was tied to the brilliant, diverse minds that worked on the floors below me, and the millions of people whose lives would be permanently improved by the technology we created together. A soft, melodic chime from my desk console signaled the opening of the global financial markets. Novatech was officially expanding into a new hemisphere, and the entire corporate world was watching my next move. I took one last deep, long breath, letting the absolute clarity of my purpose fill my lungs completely. I turned away from the sprawling window, stepping confidently back toward the center of the executive room. The blinding golden sunlight flooded through the massive glass panes, washing out all the lingering dark shadows and leaving absolutely nothing behind but pure, unadulterated brilliance. The screen fades to black on a powerful, resilient woman who finally realized that she was always the ultimate prize.